What if the man you condemned in print was never truly guilty, but knew exactly how to make you believe he was? And what if the verdict didn't end the story, but instead began your own silent trial? Welcome to Classic Storytime Hub. Tonight's story is Max Hensig, Bacteriologist and Murderer by Algernon Blackwood, a classic mystery story, reimagined and retold for the modern age.
The New York Vulture had no shortage of men who could write. But Williams was different. Among the 20 general reporters, he had climbed quietly, steadily, until he stood near the top. Not because he was loud, not because he pushed, but because he understood something the others didn't, that even the most ordinary story had a pulse if you knew where to press. He could find the humor buried in a city council vote, the quiet tragedy inside a traffic report, that rare ability to make readers feel something about nothing. The editors noticed. They always notice. So he had reason to expect better. That morning, he stood back and watched. One by one, the city editor called them forward, the younger men, the ones Williams had trained, in a way, simply by existing near them. They approached the news desk and walked away with the good assignments, the ones that made careers, the ones that ended up above the fold. Williams watched each one go, said nothing. Waited. His turn came. The city editor looked up, said 3 words. The Hensig story. Williams held himself very still. Something tightened in his chest. Not quite anger, not yet. A flash of something sharper. The quiet humiliation of a man who had prepared, who always prepared, and yet could not place the name. Every morning reporter in New York was expected to arrive already knowing. He had read the papers, all of them, cover to cover. And yet, nothing. Hensig. The name floated there, unattached to anything. 100 to 150 words, Mr. Williams. Cover the trial, get interviews. Hensig, the lawyers, everyone. No night assignment until it's done. The editor had already moved on. He was talking to Weeks now, Weeks who wrote the weather story, and Williams turned away from the desk, slowly. The kind of slow that means a man is working very hard to appear calm. He sat down, pulled the papers toward him, began to search. It took longer than it should have. And when he found it, when he finally understood what the Hensig story was, the disgust settled over him like cold air. A murder trial. Buried in the corners of page 6, page 8, page 11, small print, no photograph, the kind of story that editors drop in to fill space, the way you'd tuck a napkin under a wobbling table leg. Williams had covered murders before, dozens of them. They blurred together after a while. The courtrooms, the lawyers with their rehearsed outrage, the defendants who wept or didn't. He leaned back. A soft job, he told himself. No second assignment tonight. He'd be out by 8, he'd eat a real meal, sleep like a human being, wake up without ink on his hands. He told himself that was something. He almost believed it.
Murder trials all looked the same after a while. That was the problem. They moved in the same rhythm, spoke in the same language, ended in the same silence. The press associations handled them, the flimsy men, as they were known, those wire reporters who fed the same gray paragraphs to a dozen papers at once. No self-respecting editor sent a special man to a murder trial unless the case had something in it, something strange, something that didn't fit. This one, as far as Williams could tell, fit perfectly. He walked out into the open air across from Newspaper Row, squinting into the sunlight, and cursed, quietly, professionally, the particular boredom that comes from doing a job too well for too long. Max Hensig, German, a doctor, accused of injecting his second wife with arsenic until she stopped breathing. They had buried her, and weeks passed, and it was only the family, suspicious, persistent, the kind of people who ask questions at funerals, who pushed for the exhumation. They found the poison. They found enough of it. Williams vaguely remembered the arrest. He hadn't paid much attention. He walked and thought and felt the particular flatness of a man assigned to something beneath him. But there had been a time when none of this was flat. He remembered that, too. The first time he crossed the Bridge of Sighs, that narrow covered passage connecting the tomb's prison to the courts, something happened to him that he had never quite been able to name. The Egyptian columns rose on either side like the walls of something ancient and indifferent. The stone seemed to absorb sound. The air was different in there, heavier, the kind of heavy that presses against the chest and reminds a man very quietly that he is mortal. The first time he walked Murderer's Row, he had nearly run. His throat had closed, his feet had slowed. He had looked at the cell doors, just the doors, not even the men behind them, and something animal in him had said, "Leave." He had stayed. He always stayed, but he never forgot that feeling. And even now, years later, some ghost of it returned each time he entered that building. He had interviewed men the night before their executions, sat across from them in the half-dark and asked questions. Some of those conversations still surfaced at 3 a.m, uninvited. And the trials. The first time he watched a man break apart in a courtroom, a condemned man, words pouring out of him like water from a cracked vessel, calling on God in long-invented names, eyes rolling white against dark skin, voice climbing registers it was never meant to reach. Williams had felt his pen go still. He had simply watched, absorbed, his heart doing something irregular in his chest. The story that ran the next day had been written by the flimsy man. 1 column, buried, and that, more than anything, had taught him something cold and necessary about the gap between what a moment is and what the world decides it's worth. He had covered the Chinaman who gave nothing away, not a flicker, not a tremor, wood in human form. The Italian who moved too fast with a blade and seemed almost confused by the consequences. The farm girl, young, plain-faced, who had walked into her parents' room in the dark of night, wearing nothing so that the blood would not follow her back to bed. She did what she came to do. Then she walked out. That one stayed with him for a long time. They all had, at first. They visited him in the hours before dawn, those faces, sat at the edge of his sleep and waited. But that was before the sameness set in, before he understood that even the unbearable, repeated often enough, becomes routine. He had grown a second skin. That was the only way to explain it. Month after month in the criminal courts, and something in him had quietly calcified, not hardened in the brutal sense, but settled, organized. The part of him that used to flinch had learned instead to observe. An execution at Sing Sing could still reach him if he let it. The electric chair had a particular quality of silence afterward that no amount of professional distance could fully dissolve. But murder alone? Mere murder? Nothing. He entered the tombs the way a man enters a building he has worked in for years, with the low, familiar weight of the place pressing down on him, that vague oppression the stone walls always produced, and nothing more. No dread, no particular feeling about the man waiting inside. Just the smell, that musty, lightless smell of old iron and older stone, and the sound of his own footsteps. He was at the second iron door, waiting for the warder to peer through the grating, when he heard it, a voice, behind him. He turned. The Chronicle man, the senator. Williams felt something loosen slightly in his chest, the particular relief of finding a familiar face in an unpleasant place. He almost smiled. "Hello, Senator. What good trail are you following down here?" It was a genuine question. The senator didn't take small assignments. He didn't do corners of page 6. Whatever he was covering, it ran on the front page of the Chronicle, and it ran long. "Same as you, I guess. Hensig." Williams blinked. "There's no space in Hensig. Are you back on salary?" The senator laughed, that easy, uncomplicated laugh of his. "Not a chance, but Hensig's good for 200 easy. Word is there's a whole list behind him. Other women, other deaths. This is just the first time anyone caught him." A pause. "Poison?" The senator nodded. Williams waited in the corridor while his colleague spoke with the warder, and he watched him the way you watch someone you genuinely like, with that quiet appreciation that rarely gets spoken aloud. The senator had been good to him when he first arrived in New York, green and English and not especially welcome in the tight, territorial world of the city's press corps. He had opened doors simply by standing next to them. There was something in his face, common, honest, warm, that made people trust him without knowing why. Williams had always thought of him as a cart horse. He meant it kindly. Stolid, strong, the kind of man whose emotions were large and simple and entirely real. "Get a hustle on, Senator." They followed the warder down the flagged corridor. The cells lined both sides, each one holding its occupant in the particular stillness of men who have run out of things to do. Williams didn't look at them directly. He had learned not to. The warder's keys swung and clinked in the half-dark, a small domestic sound in a place that had nothing domestic about it. Then the warder stopped, pointed. "Here's your gentleman." He moved on without ceremony, leaving the two reporters standing at the bars. Inside, a young man paced, back and forth, unhurried. He was tall, slim, younger-looking than the file had suggested, flaxen hair almost pale enough to disappear in certain light, eyes, when they turned and caught the dim corridor glow, a very bright, very clear blue. His skin was white, his face was open, unguarded, the kind of face that belongs to someone who has, if the world can tell, done nothing worse than arrive late to dinner. Williams stood at the bars and looked at him, the man who, allegedly, had poisoned his wife, who had, if the senator's information was right, done this before, more than once, a whole list. He looked like he couldn't hurt a kitten. Williams kept looking.
From the Chronicle and the Vulture. That was all Williams said. The standard introduction. 2 words and a paper name, the way reporters announce themselves everywhere, efficiently, without ceremony. The young man stopped pacing. He turned toward the bars slowly, and for a moment he simply looked. Not at the senator, not at the cell door or the corridor or the warder somewhere behind them in the dark. At Williams. Directly, steadily, the way a man looks when he is deciding something. And in that moment, in the space between one breath and the next, the face changed. The openness was still there, technically. The features hadn't rearranged themselves, but something behind the eyes had shifted, the way light shifts when a cloud moves across it. And what Williams saw now was not the face of a man who couldn't hurt a kitten. He couldn't have said it what it was exactly. He couldn't have written it in a notebook. But his body understood before his mind did, and he stepped, just slightly, just half a step, to the side. He didn't know why he did it. He would think about that later. "I guess you wish me to say I did it?" the doctor said. His voice was cool, accented, German, pronounced, unhurried. "I have no copy for you just now." A faint pause, something that wasn't quite a smile. "At the trial you will see, it is nothing but spite, jealousy. Another woman's jealousy. I loved my wife. I would not have killed her for anything in this world. The senator stepped in smoothly. He was better at this part, the delicate architecture of a difficult interview, the way you had to build a small shelter of sympathy before you could ask anything real. Of course, doctor, of course. But you understand, in New York, the newspapers try a man just as surely as the courts do. We thought you might want to speak directly to the public, make a statement. It could help your case considerably. Nothing can help my case. The warmth dropped out of the room. In this damned country, where justice is bought with dollars, nothing helps except money. He said it without self-pity, factual, cold. Then he steadied himself, and when he continued, his voice had a different quality, deliberate, almost instructive. But I tell you two things. You may write them. He held up a finger. First, no motive can be shown, none, because I loved Zinka, and I wished her to live, always. He paused. The second finger. And second, he stopped. His eyes moved back to Williams, who was writing in shorthand, and stayed there. With my knowledge, my exceptional knowledge of poisons and bacteriology, I could have done this in a dozen different ways, without leaving a trace, without anyone ever knowing. The voice dropped just slightly. Pumping arsenic into a body, that is a fool's method, clumsy, childish, sure of discovery. Another pause. You see? He turned away, sat down on the wooden bench. The interview, apparently, was over. Outside in the corridor, moving toward the lawyer's offices, the senator laughed softly. Seems he took a fancy to you. Never looked at me once. Williams didn't laugh. He's got a bad face, he said, quiet, flat, the face of a devil. I don't feel complimented. A beat. I'd hate to be in his power. Same here. The senator glanced at him sideways. Come on, silver dollars. We need to wash the taste out. And so they went, as reporters always go after certain interviews, instinctively, without needing to discuss it, up the Bowery, into the saloon where the Tammany owner had pressed real silver dollars into every stone of the floor, a small, absurd extravagance that somehow made the place feel more real than the tombs had. They drank. They said little. They let the noise of the room fill the space where the doctor's voice had been. Then they moved further up the street to Steve Brody's and drank some more. The dirty taste faded. Almost.
There'll be others there, said the senator. He meant drinks. He also meant reporters. In this world, the two arrived together. Williams said nothing. He was still thinking about the cell, about the way the doctor's eyes had moved, that slow, deliberate tracking, like something calculating distance. He followed the senator through the door and let the noise of the place cover him. Steve Brody's was exactly what it always was. Loud, warm, slightly dishonest in the way that all beloved places are slightly dishonest. Brody himself had built his entire reputation on a single act that may or may not have occurred, a leap from the Brooklyn Bridge, a long fall, the black water of the East River coming fast, and then somehow a man still breathing at the bottom of it. Nobody could prove it happened. Nobody could prove it didn't. And Brody had understood with the instincts of a natural showman that the gap between those two positions was worth more than the truth either way. The walls knew it. Every inch of them was covered in oil paintings. The bridge stretched to impossible heights, the water somewhere far below like a dark rumor, and in the middle of all that empty air, Steve Brody himself, arms spread, face wearing the expression of a man who has just remembered something pleasant. Williams glanced at the paintings and looked away. At the corner table, as expected, two familiar shapes. Whitey Fife of the Recorder, albino pale, sharp-eyed, the kind of clever that doesn't announce itself. He wrote the daily weather story for his paper, which sounds like a punishment until you've read one. He could pull a full column out of a Tuesday afternoon drizzle and make it feel like literature. The weather clerk,
A man of some dignity, or at least a man who believed he had some, had sustained professional offense at being described in print as Farmer Dunn cleaning his rat-tail file and at having his office referred to as a down-country farm. But the public loved it. Whitey kept writing. The clerk kept objecting. Beside him, Galusha Owen of the World, when sober, one of the better men in the room. His flannel collar had climbed so far up through his long hair it was approaching his ears, and he had the comfortable, slightly unfocused look of a man who had already pledged Whitey several times that morning and intended to continue. Both of them, Williams realized with a sinking feeling, were on the Hensig story. He pulled out a chair and sat down. It was a small thing, finding colleagues on the same assignment, but it settled something in him that he hadn't wanted settled. It meant the case had weight. It meant interviews, follow-ups, the long daily proximity to a man he had already, in the space of one brief encounter, decided he disliked. More than disliked. He was beginning to hate him. He recognized the feeling, the way you recognize weather coming. The four of them drank and talked, and after a while the conversation found its way, as conversations between reporters always do, to the last time they had all been in the same room for the same story, the asylum. A private facility, an unlicensed doctor running it for profit, taking money from families who needed their difficult relatives to simply disappear, not dead, just gone, just managed, just somewhere else. Most of the patients had arrived sane. That was the part that stayed with you. Sane and heavily paid for and left there long enough that the distinction stopped mattering. The Board of Health moved before dawn, surrounded the building in the dark while the city slept. The doctor had opened his front door at first light and walked directly into an arrest. It had been, from a purely professional standpoint, an extraordinary story. "My space bill ran to $60 a day for nearly a week," said Whitey, his voice thickened by the morning's drinking. The others laughed, because everyone at the table knew that Whitey had written most of it by lifting from the evening papers. "Dead cinch," Owen said, his collar still climbing. "I faked the whole second day without going down there at all." He raised his glass in Whitey's direction, the 10th such gesture of the morning. Whitey leered back at him with genuine warmth, offered a compliment too thick to be entirely sincere, and emptied his glass. Williams drank and said little. The doctor's voice was still in the room with him. In a dozen ways, without leaving a trace. He ordered another round. "Hensig's going to be good." The senator said it the way he said most things, easily, without weight. He signaled for another round and leaned back in his chair, and Williams felt something tighten in him at the sound of the name, a small involuntary thing, like a nerve that had been touched without warning. Galusha and Whitey hadn't done a stroke of work on the case yet. They leaned forward together, suddenly interested. Whitey's pink eyes brightened against the purple flush of his face. He turned to Owen with the unsteady enthusiasm of a man 4 drinks past good judgment. "Run down to the Toms and get an interview." "Absolutely not," the senator cut in. "You're both useless right now, and you'll ruin it. Williams and I will toss for it." He looked around the table. "And we all share everything on this one. No beats, no exclusives. We all give up together." The coin landed against Williams. He swallowed the last of his gin fizz, stood and went back out into the street. The Bowery opened around him, loud, unwashed, relentlessly alive. Clothing store men pulled at his sleeve as he passed. He bought a bag of peanuts from an Italian pushcart without quite deciding to, and walked slowly, eating without tasting, while his mind did something he hadn't asked it to do. It went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of an empty afternoon, a different kind. The quiet of something working below the surface. Something that had been there since the cell, since the bars, since that half-step sideways he still couldn't explain, and that had been sitting in the back of his skull all through the drinking and the laughter and the talk about the lunatic asylum, patient and persistent, waiting for the noise to thin. He knew the feeling. He had learned in this work to recognize the difference between the thoughts you were having and the thoughts that were having you. This was the second kind. He walked. The slum streets narrowed. The smell changed. Garbage, river damp, something fried somewhere above him in an open window. The thing rose a little higher. He could feel its shape now, even if he couldn't see its face. Something disagreeable. Something that had gotten underneath the second skin he'd spent months building, found the edge of it and slipped through. Then it came all the way up. And it had a face. Flaxen hair, ice blue eyes, an expression of absolute, unhurried calm. Dr. Max Hensig looked back at him from inside his own mind, cool and faintly smiling, and Williams stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the street. And then, without meaning to, without deciding to, he turned around. There was nothing behind him. Of course there was nothing. A woman carrying a basket, 2 boys running, the ordinary motion of an ordinary street at an ordinary hour. He knew even as he turned that he would find nothing. A man with steadier nerves wouldn't have turned at all. He knew that too. But his body had its own logic, and his body had turned. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, looking back the way he had come. Then he faced forward again and kept walking towards the Tums, the bag of peanuts loose in his hand, the name sitting quietly at the center of everything. Hensig. He had the sudden, irrational, entirely unprofessional conviction that the name was going to cost him something. He didn't know what yet. He kept walking.
He stood in the street and tried to understand himself. That was the honest version of what was happening. Not fear exactly. He had been afraid before, and this was different. Cleaner than fear, and somehow worse. Something had entered the normal current of his thinking and didn't belong there. A foreign thing. And the mind, like the body, knows when something foreign has gotten in. He turned it over carefully. Hensig was a murderer. That much was established, or near enough. But Williams had sat across from murderers before, had looked into their faces, had written their words down in shorthand, had shaken some of their hands. He had covered men who killed with their fists, with knives, with whatever was nearest. He had sat with a condemned man the night before the chair and listened to him talk about his mother. None of those faces had done this to him. Some had haunted him, yes, the ones whose cases carried unusual horror, the ones whose eyes held something the human face wasn't designed to hold. But those men had been explicable in the end. Their darkness had a shape you could trace. Hensig's didn't. That was what he couldn't find his way around. There was nothing he could point to, nothing he could write in a notebook and label. A light-haired young man with blue eyes and a drooping mustache, pacing a cell with the patience of someone who has decided to wait. Nothing in the features, nothing in the voice, except the accent and the cold precision of the words. And yet, he stood there, probing at it, the way you probe at a bruise to find its edge. Then he looked up. Above the prison walls, the sky was doing something almost offensive in its beauty. Deep blue, white clouds moving across it with the easy confidence of things that have never been indoors. The wind came down the street, carrying something with it, something that didn't belong in the city at all. The faint, clean suggestion of the sea, of open beaches, of distance. It moved through him like a small mercy, and he caught himself shivering, not from cold, but from the particular pleasure of being briefly, unexpectedly reminded that the world was large. Then his eyes came back down to the tombs. The granite rose in massive, dark steps. No sky behind those walls, no wind inside them. The shift happened in an instant, fields to cells, sea air to stone, and in that instant, in the sudden violent contrast between the living world at his back and the dead weight of the building in front of him, something clicked into place. He understood. Hensig was no ordinary murderer, not in any way that could be measured or filed or written into 150 words for the morning edition. The man stood outside the normal category, not further along the same spectrum as the others, somewhere else entirely, off the map, the kind of thing that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to, because it has learned long ago that patience is more effective than display. The knowledge arrived with the force and finality of something that had always been true. He had felt it in the cell, felt it before he understood it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before the storm arrives. It had entered him then, quietly, and had been working through his system ever since, the way certain things work, without permission, without noise, and with absolute thoroughness. A faster mind would have named it sooner. Williams named it now, standing in the June sunlight with the smell of the sea still faint in the air, looking at the building they called the Tombs. Then he straightened his coat and went inside.
He knew his own weaknesses. He had never pretended otherwise. The drinking was real. The drugs were real. More than a passing acquaintance, if he was being honest, which he rarely was about this particular subject. His nerves, on the best of days, operated closer to the surface than was professionally ideal. And the work itself didn't help. Years of moving through the criminal and the abnormal, the unwholesome architecture of human nature at its worst, it left deposits. The kind that didn't wash out with a gin fizz at Silver Dollars. He knew all of this. And so he had developed, quietly and without telling anyone, a private discipline. Once a week he swept. That was the only word for it. A deliberate, methodical clearing of the mind, the way you clear a room that has been closed too long. Everything that had lodged itself during the week, the faces, the testimonies, the things said in cells and courtrooms that had no business living in a man's head rent-free. He swept them out. And then he went to the woods, built a fire, cooked something over it, walked until the city stopped living behind his eyes and the trees took over. He came back cleaner. It had worked more times than he could count. It had kept him functional in a job that consumed lesser men entirely. He turned those brooms on now, standing outside the Tombs. He tried, deliberately and with professional discipline, to reduce Hensig to what he was on paper, a prisoner, a case number, 150 words due by evening, an ordinary interview with an ordinary man. He almost managed it. He went inside. He came out an hour later, barely keeping his pace steady. The interview had confirmed everything the irrational part of him had already known, and added details the irrational part hadn't thought to imagine. Hensig started cautiously, measured, reluctant, giving nothing. But Williams had learned over years of difficult interviews how to open doors the subject didn't intend to leave unlocked. He pressed intelligently, carefully, and something in the doctor responded to intelligence the way a flame responds to air. He warmed. Not emotionally, not personally, a colder warming than that, intellectual, precise, the enthusiasm of a man discussing a field he has mastered and rarely gets to discuss with anyone worth talking to. He began to lecture, pacing the cell, gesturing, his long white fingers moving through the air with the fluid confidence of a man at a podium. How easy it was, he explained, how extraordinarily, almost insultingly easy for a man who actually knew what he was doing. And he knew what he was doing. No competent man, he said, no man with real knowledge would use arsenic, Injected poisons, detectable compounds, substances that sat in the body's tissues for weeks like signatures. That was amateur work, clumsy, the method of a man who'd read one book and understood nothing. He stopped at the bars. His fingers wrapped around the iron, long, white, unhurried. His eyes found Williams and stayed there. "What is more easy," he said, his voice dropping to something almost conversational, almost kind, "than to take a disease germ, of typhus, of plague, of any germ you please, and make so virulent a culture that no medicine in the world could counteract it. A really powerful microbe." A pause. Precise, deliberate. "And then scratch the skin of your victim with a pin." The fingers tightened slightly on the bars. "And who could accuse you of murder?" He said it the way a professor states a theorem, self-evident, elegant, already solved. He wrote it down. His hand was steady. He had trained it to be steady. The rest of him was not. The bars were between them. Williams was glad of that, genuinely physically glad, in a way he had never been glad of bars before, in all the times he had stood on this side of them, because something was moving in that cell that didn't require a door to travel through. He could feel it. A cold pressure, sourceless, settling against his chest like a hand pressed flat. He had met every variety of killer this city produced. Men who killed for money, men who killed for women, men who killed in the white heat of a moment they spent the rest of their lives trying to explain. He understood all of those, not condoned, understood. Any man with strong enough passions carried the seed of it. That was simply the truth about human beings, uncomfortable and ordinary in equal measure. But this was something outside that category entirely. Hensig had not killed his wife in a moment of heat. There had been no passion, no jealousy, no comprehensible human hunger driving the act. What Williams had just listened to, what he had written down in shorthand with a hand he had trained to stay steady, was a man describing murder the way a craftsman describes his tools, with satisfaction, with the quiet pride of expertise. Under no emotion greater, Williams now felt certain, than the mild relief of boredom briefly interrupted. He thought less of human life than of flies in summer, and he was better at ending it. Williams walked out through the prison gates into the open air, and the sunlight hit him like a small shock, too bright, too warm, too indifferent to what had just happened inside. He stood for a moment, blinking. The mental brooms were still. For the first time in longer than he could remember, they simply refused to move. The horror had weight. It stayed. He walked. And then he walked directly into Dowling. Policeman Dowling, 9th Precinct, broad-faced and Irish, and genuinely pleased to see him, the kind of pleased that only exists between two men who have done each other a good turn and never forgotten it. Williams had written Dowling's capture of a con man in terms so glowing, so strategically heroic, that the fact of Dowling having been nearly too drunk to hold on to the prisoner had been entirely obscured by the prose. Dowling had made plain clothes on the strength of that article. He had never stopped being grateful. Know of anything good today? It was pure habit. He asked it the way he breathed. Dowling's broad face opened to something close to pride. Bet your bottom dollar. One of the best. He paused for effect, the way men do when they've been waiting all morning to say something. I've got Hensig. Williams felt it move through him. Not quite a sound, not quite a sensation, the particular exhaustion of a man who keeps turning corners and finding the same thing waiting. No escape, he thought. Apparently none at all. The name followed him up the street like a second shadow, patient and unhurried, keeping perfect pace. "Can't use it at trial," Dowling said.
glancing sideways along the street. "But I'll tell you this, I'd have been happier not knowing most of it myself." He tilted his head toward the side door of the nearest saloon. "Come in, I'll set them up." Williams followed, not eagerly. Inside, the light was low, and the air smelled of old wood and spilled beer, and the particular staleness of a room that never quite gets opened. Dowling ordered with the comfortable authority of a man who does this often. Scotch for the Englishman, delivered with a heavy wink, and something elaborate for himself, involving peach bitters. He put a $50 on the bar. The bartender pushed it back without being asked. They understood each other. "What's yours, Mike?" "I'll take a cigar," said the bartender, pocketing a dime and placing a cheap cigar in his waistcoat pocket in one practiced motion, then moving away to give them room. They leaned close, voices low, heads almost touching. 15 minutes. Williams listened. He kept his face arranged into the expression of a man receiving information professionally. He had learned that expression years ago, neutral, attentive, giving nothing back. He wore it now with some effort. He set up another round. The bartender took his money this time. They talked a little longer. Williams went rather white about the gills. Dowling was very much in earnest. "I should get back," Williams said, finally. "The boys are waiting at Brody's." "Right." Dowling straightened, rolled his shoulders, resumed the dimensions of a man who has said what he came to say. "We'll have one more, no ill feeling." He signaled. They drank. The bartender accepted another dime and pocketed another cigar with the serenity of a man whose system works perfectly. At the door, Dowling lowered his voice one final time. "Don't print any of that. Don't give it up to the others either." He held Williams' eye for a moment. "But if you want to know it straight, take the cars down to Amityville, Long Island. Have a look around. You'll find it holds up." Then he was gone, back into the bright, indifferent morning. Williams walked back to Brody's with his thoughts moving around him like a swarm he couldn't outpace. What Dowling had told him had done something to the horror, not reduced it, not clarified it, but multiplied it, tenfold at least. He turned it over as he walked, testing it for exaggeration, for the natural inflation of a policeman who wanted his name in the papers and his story to land well. He found he couldn't make it hold. Dowling wasn't that kind of liar. The earnestness was real. The discomfort behind the eyes was real. It was probably all true, and he couldn't write a word of it. All the others wanted was the interview, the doctor's own words, the bacteriology lecture, the cold academic enthusiasm about methods and microbes. That was good for half a column, even cleaned up, even with the worst of it removed. He would give them that and keep the rest somewhere darker, somewhere he could feel it sitting without being able to name it precisely. He pushed open the door to Brody's. The senator was mid-story, leaning across the table at Galusha with the animated pleasure of a man who tells things well. Whitey Fife was doing something at the far end of the table involving cocktail glasses and the edge, lifting them, letting them drop, snatching them back from the floor at the last possible instant. Each one was Steve Brody. Each one jumped from the bridge. Each one survived by a narrowing margin. The room was watching. Then one didn't. The glass hit the stones and exploded, and the roar that went up shook the walls. 5 or 6 men moved to the bar with the cheerful inevitability of a debt being collected. Williams moved with them. He drank. He let the noise fill the space where Dowling's words had been living. It helped, the way these things always helped. Temporarily, partially, and not quite enough. Whitey and Galusha eventually left, unsteady but purposeful, having arranged to collect the story from Williams that evening. He watched them go. The senator looked across the table at him. Williams said nothing. He ordered another drink.
"Get much?"
"More than I care about." He said it simply, without drama, and then told the senator everything, the whole of it. Dowling's voice dropping in the saloon, the 15 minutes of low conversation, the whiteness he'd felt moving up through him while he kept his face arranged into something professional. The senator listened without interrupting, making occasional notes, his expression growing quieter and more serious with each passing minute. When Williams finished, the senator closed his notebook. "I think Dowling's right. Let's go to Amityville." 20 miles out on Long Island, scattered and quiet,
The kind of village that knows everything about everyone and says most of it to strangers if approached correctly. This was where Hensig had lived and practiced, where the second Mrs. Hensig had died in a way that troubled the people who had watched it happen. They spoke to everyone. The man behind the counter at the drugstore, the parson, the undertaker, who had, it turned out, more to say than either of the others, and said it with the measured gravity of a man who has been waiting for someone to ask. Neighbors, people who had sat across from Hensig at dinner tables, who had watched him move through the small social geometry of a small town, and had noticed things they hadn't known how to report and had filed instead in the part of the mind reserved for things that make you uneasy in the dark. The stories they heard would fill a book. On the steamer back to New York, the two men sat with the water moving dark beneath them and the city lights beginning to appear on the horizon, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "Good stuff," the senator said finally. His voice was grave in a way Williams hadn't heard from him before. The senator, who was stolid, who was steady, who processed the world with the reliable calm of a cart horse. "Nothing we can use," Williams said. "Nothing the district attorney can either." The senator was quiet again. When he spoke, it was almost to himself, low, deliberate, as though he was still working out whether he believed what he was saying. "It's simply a devil, not a man at all." A pause. The water moved. "Utterly without morals, of any kind." He shook his head slowly. "I'm going to tell McSweater to put me on something else." And Williams understood, because the stories had shown them something consistent and terrible in its consistency. Hensig had not been discreet about what he believed, not boastful in the crude public sense. He hadn't announced himself in the street, but he had let it fall, in conversation, in unguarded moments, with the casual ease of a man expressing opinions he has never thought to hide because he has never considered them unusual. That as a doctor he held a natural authority over life and death, that enemies did not, in his experience, last long, that a person who became a nuisance, a genuine nuisance, a trouble, could be reasonably removed provided one was careful about it. He had said these things to multiple people over time, and many of those people, when pressed, admitted quietly that they did not think he stopped at saying them. "There's nothing to give up to Whitey or Galusha," the senator said, "and barely anything we can print." "I don't think I'd care to print it anyway," Williams laughed, a short, thin sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. The senator turned and looked at him. The look was a question. Williams met it and said nothing. The city grew larger on the horizon. The water was very dark, and somewhere in the middle of it all, between the village they had left and the city they were returning to, that thing that had been following Williams since that first moment at the bars, that cold, sourceless pressure, settled a little deeper and made itself at home. "Hensig may be acquitted," Williams said. "He may walk out of there a free man." The senator held that thought for a moment, the way you hold something you'd rather put down. "I guess you're right." A pause. Then, with the deliberate effort of a man choosing to surface, "Come on, let's get dinner in Chinatown and write our copy together." Pell Street at night had its own particular atmosphere, close, layered, the smells arriving before everything else. They climbed dark wooden stairs into a Chinese restaurant where the air was thick with opium smoke and cooking that had nothing to do with anything either man had grown up eating. Small tables, sanded floor, the comfortable disorder of a place that has never tried to be anything other than what it is. They ordered in brown bowls, chow chop suey, chow am dong, and washed it down with white whiskey that burned with the clean efficiency of something that doesn't pretend to be subtle. Then they moved to a corner table, spread their paper, and began to write. Two men turning a day's worth of darkness into column inches for the morning edition. The great American public would read it with their coffee. Across the smoky room, a woman came in alone and sat down at an empty table and ordered whiskey. One of the degraded white women who drifted through Chinatown's edges.
4,000 Chinese men in the quarter, and not a single Chinese woman. She sat and drank and looked at nothing in particular. The senator glanced at her, then back at his paper. "Not much to choose between Hensig and that," he said. "All the difference in the world." Williams didn't look up from his writing. "She's been decent once. She may be again someday. But that doctor?" He stopped, set his pencil down for just a moment. "He has never been anything but what he is, not for a single day of his life. A soulless, intellectual devil. He doesn't belong to humanity at all." A pause. "I've got a horrid idea that... How do you spell bacteriology? 2 R's or 1? 2 R's and 1 K, Williams said, and laughed. A real laugh this time, brief and genuine, the kind that only comes when tension finds an unexpected exit. They wrote for another hour. Then they went to Park Row and turned it in. The trial of Max Hensig lasted 2 weeks. His relatives sent money. The money bought good lawyers. The lawyers bought time, delays, motions, procedural architecture designed to make the truth as difficult as possible to reach. From a newspaper perspective, it collapsed almost immediately into tedium. By the end of the 4th day, most editors had pulled their best men and sent them somewhere more deserving. The story wasn't moving. The story wasn't selling. Williams stayed. He was kept on it until the end, and he did not entirely mind, which told him something about himself he didn't examine too closely. A reporter has no business inserting himself into a story that is still before the courts. That is the rule, and it is a reasonable one, and New York journalism observed it with the particular flexibility of a profession that has always maintained its own relationship with dignity and the law. Into Williams' daily reports, quietly, incrementally, by inference rather than statement, crept something that was not strictly reportage. The things he had heard at Amityville, the things Dowling had said in the saloon with his voice dropped low, the memory of long white fingers on iron bars and a voice explaining with academic warmth how easy it all was. None of it appeared directly, none of it could, but it was there, beneath the sentences, the way cold is beneath ice, present, structural, impossible to miss if you knew how to read. Anyone who followed his column came to the same conclusion, arrived at independently, apparently of their own free will, that Dr. Max Hensig was a calculating, cold-blooded murderer of the most dangerous kind, the kind that thinks, the kind that plans, the kind that, if the evidence didn't hold, might simply walk back out into the world and continue. Williams wrote every word of it with a steady hand, and tried not to think about what came next.
Every morning, without exception, that was the arrangement. Williams went to the cell before court opened, and Hensig received him, and they talked. The awkwardness of it, that a man could read every day what another man had written about his guilt, and then sit across from that man the following morning and discuss the weather, was the kind of awkwardness that has no polite resolution. You simply endure it and keep your face arranged correctly. Hensig made it easy, in the worst possible way. He showed no embarrassment whatsoever. All the papers were supplied to him. He read everything. He read Williams' columns with the attentive thoroughness of a man reviewing his own biography, and he must have understood precisely what those columns implied, the inference beneath each sentence, the horror kept just below the surface of the prose. He said nothing about fairness. He raised no objections. He simply continued to appear each morning in a clean shirt and a new tie, never wearing the same suit on consecutive days, studying the descriptions of his own appearance in the press with the focused interest of a man managing a public image. He noted everything. If a paper failed to mention his clothes, his bearing, the quality of his self-possession in the courtroom, he noticed the omission. When a paper called him smart, composed, admirably controlled, he was visibly pleased, delighted even. The vanity was immense and entirely without shame, because shame requires a particular kind of self-awareness that Hensig had simply never developed. He was the center of the largest story in the city, and he knew it, and he loved it. Williams found this, somehow, more disturbing than anything else. One morning, Hensig was in an expansive mood. "They make a hero of me," he said, almost warmly. "And if I go to the chair, which I think I will not, you know," a small, composed smile, "you shall see something fine. Perhaps they electrocute only a corpse." Williams said nothing. Then Hensig turned, and for the first time, in all the mornings, all the conversations, he addressed the articles directly. He did it lightly, almost affectionately, which was worse. "I only report what is said and done in court," Williams said, and heard his own voice come out thicker than he intended. "I'm always ready to write anything you care to say." "I have no fault to find," Hensig said. His blue eyes were fixed through the bars with the steady, clinical attention he gave to everything. "You think I have killed, and you show it in all your sentences." A pause, measured and deliberate. "Have you ever seen a man in the chair?" Williams had. He said so. "Ach was," the doctor absorbed this with mild interest. "You have indeed." "It's instantaneous," Williams added, quickly, too quickly. "It must be quite painless." It was not what he believed, but what else do you say to a man who may, within weeks, be strapped into that particular piece of furniture with a band across his shaved head? Some mercies are just words. They still need to be said. Hensig laughed. He turned and began to pace, that familiar back and forth, the unhurried rhythm of a man entirely at home in a cage. Williams watched him and felt his shoulders drop slightly, the tension finding somewhere to go. Then it happened. Without warning, without transition, Hensig moved. Not walked, moved. The word for it was the word you'd use for something that isn't quite human in its speed and economy. He crossed the cell and was at the bars before Williams had processed the motion, pressing his face between the iron, close, closer than he'd ever come, and his expression had changed entirely. Something new was on it, something that had been kept in a room Williams hadn't known existed, and the door had just opened. Williams stepped back. One pace, involuntary, the body deciding before the mind. "There are worse ways of dying than that," Hensig said. His voice had dropped to something almost private, almost intimate. The blue eyes held a light that had no warmth in it at all. "I shall get out. I shall not be convicted." A breath. "I shall get out, and then perhaps I come and tell you about them." The corridor was very quiet. Williams stood one pace back from where he had been standing, and looked at the face between the bars, and understood, with the clean, cold certainty of a man who had stopped arguing with himself, that this was not a threat delivered in anger. It was a promise made in comfort. And that was the difference that made it unbearable. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The face rearranged itself. The door closed. The cold pallor returned like a curtain drawn across a window. And Hensig was laughing again, quietly, conversationally, discussing his lawyers, their strengths, their weaknesses, the particular usefulness of each, as though the last 30 seconds had not occurred, as though nothing had pressed its face between those bars and said what it said. Williams understood something now that he hadn't understood before. The indifference had always been a performance. Beneath the careful toilets and the clean shirts and the composed courtroom bearing, something had been burning the entire time. A real and bitter fury at being seen, at being named, at having a reporter sit across him every morning and write between the lines, "I know what you are." Hensig had enjoyed the attention. He had despised the conclusion. and he had kept both of those things perfectly separated, perfectly controlled, until the moment he chose not to. That choice, the deliberateness of it, was the part that stayed. Williams walked up the stone steps to the courtroom in the fresh air and felt the city around him like a gift he hadn't earned. The open sky, the noise of the street below, the ordinary indifferent motion of people who had nowhere near a cell to be. The face was still with him, that white face pressed between iron bars, the blue eyes holding their terrible light for just those few seconds before the door closed again. He turned the words over as he walked. Slower ways, much more painful. I shall get out. Perhaps I come and tell you about them. Had he heard correctly? Was it a threat? He examined it from several angles, the way you examine something you're hoping will turn out to be harmless, and found that it would not cooperate. The work helped, as work always helps, the mechanics of reporting, the architecture of evidence, the city editor's voice at the end of the day telling him the story was excellent and hinting, warmly, at a possible salary increase. These things occupied the foreground of his mind and gave it somewhere useful to be. But at the back, always at the back, the memory sat, patient, unhurried. The knowledge that he had made a genuine enemy of a man who was not like other enemies, not hot-blooded, not impulsive, not the kind whose anger burns out and leaves them ordinary again. A man with exceptional knowledge and exceptional patience, and a list of deaths behind him that no court had ever successfully counted. There was something almost hypnotic in it. Williams recognized that. The idea of this doctor, young, brilliant in his particular terrible way, moving through the world with something approaching a god's freedom, choosing who lived and who became inconvenient. It pressed against the imagination with unusual force. He could not think about it without the skin crawling. He could not stop thinking about it. He was profoundly, genuinely relieved when the last day of the trial arrived. The jury sat up all night. In the morning, they came back with an acquittal. The evidence had built itself carefully, methodically, and then, at the final moment, the moment that mattered, had simply failed to hold. Not enough. Not quite. The web had closed around him, and he had walked through it. And that was the end of 2 weeks and 150 words a day, and every morning at the bars. The final interview, immediately before Hensig's release into the street, was the pleasantest Williams had ever had with him. It was also the most disagreeable. "I knew I'd get out," said Hensig, with a laugh that showed almost none of the relief he must have felt beneath it. "No one believed me guilty, only my wife's family." A pause, precise and deliberate. "And yourself, Mr. Vulture reporter." The blue eyes settled on Williams with the familiar, unhurried attention. "I read every day your reports. You jumped to a conclusion too quickly, I think." "Oh, we write what we're told to write."
"Perhaps someday you write another story," Hensig said, his voice carrying that same composed, almost academic quality it always carried. "Or perhaps you read the story someone else writes, of your own trial." The blue eyes held him for just a moment longer than necessary. "Then you understand better what I make you feel." Williams asked about the trial. He asked about the future. He kept his voice level and his pencil moving and his face arranged into the expression of a man doing a job. The answer to the last question arrived like a window opening in a sealed room. "Ach, I return, of course, to Germany." A small, satisfied gesture, the gesture of a man closing an account. "I go back to Germany, of course. People here are now afraid of me a little. The newspapers have killed me instead of the chair." He smiled. Goodbye, Mr. Vulture reporter. Goodbye. Williams wrote the last interview with a relief that surprised him in its physical completeness, a loosening across the chest and shoulders like a weight set down after a long carry. But of everything he wrote, the single line that gave him the most unqualified pleasure was the one announcing Hensig's departure for Germany. He read it back twice before filing it. New York moved on. It always moved on. That was the city's defining quality and its only mercy, the perpetual churning appetite for the next horror, which meant that no single horror could hold the public attention for more than a few days before being displaced by something fresher and more immediate. The Hensig case sank into the police files at Mulberry Street, into the newspaper morgues, into the sediment of things the public had consumed and forgotten. 2 days after the acquittal, the evil doctor had effectively ceased to exist for the city that had briefly made him famous. Williams understood this mechanism better than most. He had understood it since his first week on the Vulture, when he had watched horror succeed horror with the smooth efficiency of an industrial process, each new outrage arriving precisely as the previous one was losing its grip on the public imagination. He had felt himself change under the pressure of it, not hardened exactly, not callous, but progressively less responsive, the way a nerve becomes less sensitive with repeated stimulation. Each case thrilled him a fraction less than the one before. Excess of sensation had done what excess always does. It had numbed the instrument. But Hensig was different. Hensig stayed. The personality of the man, that cold intellectual precision, that complete and untroubled absence of anything recognizably human in his relation to other people's lives, lodged somewhere deeper than the professional surface. The words came back at odd moments, on the stairs, in the dark before sleep arrived. Slower ways, much more painful. I shall get out, and perhaps I come and tell you about them. The covert threat, the ill-concealed animosity beneath the composed exterior, these things kept him alive in Williams's imagination long after the city had buried him. He visited dreams. He appeared in the transitional spaces between waking and sleep, standing at bars that were no longer there, his long white fingers curled around iron that existed only in memory, his blue eyes holding their terrible, patient light. Weeks passed, then more weeks, and then, with the slow, inevitable mercy of time and accumulated experience, Hensig began to recede. The sharp edges softened. The face became less immediate, less present, absorbed gradually into the vast layered background of everything Williams had witnessed and documented and filed and half forgotten over years of living inside the worst of what the city produced. The memory sank. The dreams stopped coming. At length it was gone, or buried deeply enough that the difference no longer mattered. He stopped thinking about it. He moved on, as the city moved on, as he always moved on. He was not aware in those quiet weeks of forgetting that somewhere across an ocean, in a country he had never visited, a man with flaxen hair and ice-blue eyes was also moving on, also waiting, also patient.
Summer ended. Williams came back from 2 weeks in the Maine backwoods bronzed and quieter than he'd left, carrying the particular stillness that only comes from sustained time among trees and open water. New York received him the way it always received people who had been briefly away, indifferently, immediately, as though he had never gone. But the city itself had changed while he was absent,
Or rather, it had become what it always became in October, when the brutal summer heat finally released its grip and something electric moved in off the water. The Hudson ran deep and brilliant in the autumn light. Across on the Jersey Palisades, the trees had turned, crimson and gold, extravagant and brief, the kind of duty that only works because it knows its ending. The streets smelled of sea wind and cool stone. The faces coming back from mountains and coastlines carried color and ease, and even the East Side, in its crowded, permanent squalor, seemed briefly, improbably cleaner. Williams felt it more than most. He always felt the seasonal turn more than most, something in him that responded to light and open air with a gratitude that bordered on the physical. The holiday had done its work. The resolutions for the coming winter felt real and achievable in a way that resolutions rarely do. He crossed to Staten Island on the big double-ender ferry one October morning and stood at the rail and let the blue water and the haze of distant woods move through him like a slow, restoring breath. The assignment was a good one for once. A German Reichstag member, a Jew-baiter, an officious and self-important man who had decided that New York needed his particular lecture series on his particular subject, was arriving on an incoming liner, and the Vulture had sent Williams to meet him at Quarantine with instructions that amounted to be witty, be pointed, and suggest firmly that he return to Bremen on the next available steamer before the flying eggs and dead cats of a Cooper Union audience made the decision for him. Williams had entered into its spirit fully. He was explaining the assignment to the quarantine doctor with some relish as the little tug steamed down the bay toward the great liner sitting at anchor inside Sandy Hook. The ship was enormous against the autumn sky. Its decks were crowded, passengers lining the rails, watching the tug approach with the particular eagerness of people who had been at sea long enough to want land back. Williams looked up at the rows of faces. And then something happened that he could not have explained and did not try to. His eyes moved, not deliberately, not as the result of any decision. They simply moved, pulled, drawn, the way a compass needle moves, away from the swinging rope ladder and along the length of the lower deck, through the rows of bronzed returning passengers, until they found and stopped at a face approximately halfway down the vessel. The face was looking directly at him, had been looking, perhaps, for some time. The eyes were bright blue, the skin surrounded on all sides by the weathered faces of people who had spent weeks in open ocean air, was remarkably, almost unnaturally white. The blood left his heart in a single violent rush. Hensig.
In an instant, the world changed. Not gradually, not with warning. The blue water of the bay went dark, as though something had passed between the sun and the surface of everything. The light didn't leave. It simply stopped meaning what it had meant 30 seconds ago. And the old sensations came back with the completeness of a physical blow. The fear, the loathing, the crawling of the skin that he had spent months carefully burying under the accumulated weight of other stories, other faces, other horrors. He grabbed the rope ladder, swung up after the health officer, angry at himself, genuinely, specifically angry that a face glimpsed across open water could do this to him, could reach across months of deliberate forgetting and find the nerve as though it had never healed. The interview with the German was the shortest of his career. He asked what he needed to ask, wrote what he needed to write, and left, catching the quarantine tug back to Staten Island rather than riding the liner up the bay into dock the way the other reporters did. He did not look back at the ship. He had not caught a second glimpse of the face, and so in the days that followed he allowed himself a careful, provisional hope, a trick of light, perhaps, a stranger with similar coloring seen at distance, processed by a mind that had been primed to expect that particular combination of pale skin and blue eyes. A subjective hallucination, nothing more. The mind under stress produces what it fears. He knew that. October became November. Nothing happened. No recurrence. No confirmation. Perhaps it had been no one. Or perhaps it had been Hensig, and Hensig had forgotten him entirely, and the return meant nothing, and the promise made through prison bars was nothing more than the theatrical exit line of a man who enjoyed theatrical exit lines. Williams almost believed this. He told Dowling anyway. The policeman laughed, the easy laugh of a man holding information he's enjoying holding. Old news. Headquarters have had an eye on him for weeks. Berlin wants a man for 2 murders, goes by the name of Brunner, and from the description we think it's our friend. He paused, savoring it. Nothing certain yet, but I'm on his trail. I'll let you know when the time comes, but not a word till then. Williams nodded, felt marginally better, told himself that was reasonable. A few weeks later, the West Side docks caught fire. It was the kind of fire that makes the city briefly beautiful and permanently afraid. Immense, roaring, the wind off the river picking up the flames and throwing them sideways until they seemed to reach halfway across the water. The surrounding ships were lit in orange and gold. The crowd was enormous, pressing and surging, held back by police lines while the fire did what it intended to do. Williams and the senator worked the edges. The main story was already telephoned in. After midnight, the heavy lifting done. They were gathering the last details, the corrections, the final texture of the thing. The senator borrowed Williams' overcoat against the spray and the flying cinders and went inside the fire lines for a final pass. Williams moved toward the corner to wait, working through the crowd, unpinning his brass fire badge from his coat as he went, that conspicuous departmental badge that marked a reporter as someone with the right to be where others couldn't go. He'd just gotten it free when the hand came out of the crowd. Fast, purposeful, not a brush, a grab, deliberate and directed, aimed specifically at the badge, closing around it with intent. He turned. The crowd lurched, one of those sudden violent redistributions of mass that happen in large frightened groups, and he was nearly taken off his feet. By the time he had steadied himself, the arm was already withdrawing, empty, the badge still in his own hand. The attempt had failed. He caught one brief impression of a sleeve disappearing back into the press of bodies. Then he was pushed, hard, onto the pavement he'd been moving toward, and the crowd closed over the space where the hand had been, and there was nothing left to see. He stood on the pavement and looked back into the crowd. The fire roared on the water. His heart was doing something irregular and insistent in his chest. At the time, it barely registered. A crowded fire scene, a hand reaching for a badge. There was nothing remarkable in that. People pushed, people grabbed, people wanted to get closer to the spectacle. Williams laughed it off, pocketed the badge, and stood watching the flames die down over the water until his friend came back. He waited. The fire settled. The crowd thinned at its edges. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. Half an hour before the figure finally appeared out of the darkness, moving oddly, Williams noticed, slowly, with a limp that didn't belong to the senator's usual heavy, confident stride. He recognized the coat first, his own check ulster, borrowed against the spray an hour ago. But the shape inside it was wrong somehow, moving wrong.
It stopped a few feet away and peered at him through the dark. "That you, Williams?" The voice was the senator's, rougher than usual, strained. "I thought you were someone else for a moment," Williams said, moving forward. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" In the dying glow of the fire, the senator's face was the color of old paper. A thin line of blood tracked down from his forehead with the slow patience of something that had been running for a while. "Some fellow nearly did for me." He said it with the flat, factual delivery of a man who is still processing what his body has just survived. "Deliberately pushed me clean off the edge of the dock." He paused. "If I hadn't landed on a broken pile and found a boat, I'd have drowned, sure as God made anything." Another pause, shorter. "And I think I know who it was." He corrected himself immediately. "No, I know. I saw his face, white as a sheet, and I heard what he said." The world went very still around Williams. "Who?" he heard himself ask. "What did he want?" The senator took his arm and moved them both toward the saloon behind them without answering, the instinctive movement of a man who wants walls and light and a glass of something before he says the rest of it. He kept glancing back over his shoulder as they walked. "Quicker we are away from this neighborhood, the better." Inside, with brandy in hand and the door behind them, he turned and looked at Williams over the glass with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and something else. Something that, in another man, might have been fear. "Who was it?" He repeated the question back, as though confirming he'd heard it. "It was Hensig. And what did he want?" He held William's eyes. "He wanted you." The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. "Me?" "He mistook me for you." The crowd was thick. I'd cut across by the dock edge. Dark, no one near me, moving fast. Something I thought was a stump got up in front of me. He set the glass down. I looked straight into his face, right into it. A breath. And he looked back at me and said, "Goodbye, Mr. Vulture Reporter," with a laugh, and pushed me backwards off the edge. Silence. "My overcoat," Williams said. The words came out very quietly. The senator nodded once. "He'd been following you right enough, all evening." The senator was not seriously injured. They established that, and then they walked. Away from the docks, away from the dying fire and the dark water, back toward Broadway and a telephone. The route took them through Little Italy's edge and into the district they called Little Africa, where the streets narrowed and the lights thinned to almost nothing, and where the unspoken understanding was that you kept to the middle of the road and moved with purpose past the dark alley mouths opening off either side. They talked the whole way, not loudly, not with the easy professional energy of two men debriefing after a story, quietly, close together, the way men talk when they are working something out that has no comfortable resolution, when the facts are clear and the implications are worse, and the only thing left to do is say it all aloud and see if it sounds as serious as it feels. It did. It sounded exactly as serious as it felt. "He's after you, no doubt," the senator said again, with a laugh that was meant to lighten the thing and didn't. Williams said nothing, because there was nothing reassuring to say, and he had stopped pretending there was. The pieces had arranged themselves with a horrible clarity. The face on the steamer, the hand reaching for the badge in the crowd, the senator going over the edge of the dock in a borrowed overcoat. Not coincidence, not paranoia, a sequence, deliberate, patient, and very nearly successful. To be hunted by an ordinary man was frightening enough. To be hunted by this man, by that white face and those cold blue eyes and that precise, unhurried intelligence that had sat in a cell and explained almost warmly how easy it was to kill without leaving anything behind, this was something of a different order entirely. Somewhere in the vast, anonymous machinery of the city, in its crowds and its darkness and its 10,000 faces, a mind charged with revenge was watching. Had been watching, perhaps, since the trial, perhaps from across an ocean,
tracking his movements, learning his coat, learning his habits, waiting with the particular patience of a man who has never been in a hurry because he has always been confident of the outcome. Death had never felt close before, not like this, not personal. He had watched others die, had written it down, had filed it, and moved on. But this was different. This had his name on it. He went to bed that night in his dingy East 19th Street room in a state that he could only describe, honestly and without dignity, as a blue funk. He stayed in it for days. He kept his eyes moving constantly, doorways, crowds, the boarding house table, the office, every corner of every room he entered. A new face anywhere on his usual circuit made something lurch in his chest before his mind could intervene. His sleep became a series of nightmares he couldn't remember clearly, but woke from with his heart already running. The good resolutions of October, the clean Maine air, the 2 weeks of trees and open water, the man he had briefly, genuinely believed he could be, dissolved without ceremony back into the old indulgences. The drinking deepened. The other things came back alongside it. He was not, he told himself, a drunkard. He moved in a world that drank. Reporters, policemen, the whole loose and thirsty ecosystem of the city's nightlife, where the greeting was, "What'll you take?" and the reproach was, "Oh, he's sworn off." Drinking was simply the medium the profession moved through, but now he counted. He had never counted before. He measured himself against sobriety with the careful attention of a man who needs to stay functional, who cannot afford to lose the edges of his awareness for even an evening, because somewhere in the city something was waiting for him to look away. He changed his routes, changed his eating places, his drinking haunts, the boarding house itself. Anything that could be predicted, he changed. Anything that could be mapped, he altered. He moved through his own life like a man rearranging furniture in the dark, trying to make himself harder to find. Fear does this to the world. It doesn't announce itself. It simply adjusts the light slightly and permanently so that everything looks a degree darker than it did before. It steals something from the sunlight. It adds weight to ordinary motion, a drag on everything, a heaviness that has no single source and no clear remedy. And on an imagination already compromised, already softened and sensitized by years of alcohol and the other things, the effect was considerable. The doctor's words came back. They had never entirely left, but now they returned with full force and took up residence. The germ, cultivated to virulence, made powerful beyond the reach of any medicine, introduced through nothing more than a pin scratch against skin. So clean, so invisible, so perfectly suited to a man who thought of murder the way other men think of craftsmanship, as a problem to be solved elegantly, without waste, without evidence, without anything left behind but a death that looked like something else. The doc was impulse. Williams understood that now. A chance encounter, a borrowed coat, a moment of opportunity seized and very nearly taken. Crude by Hensig standards, not his best work. His best work would look like nothing at all. And that was the thought that followed Williams through every room, every crowd, every ordinary day, that when it came, if it came, he would not see it coming. There would be no hand reaching out of a crowd, no push in the dark, just a scratch, just a pin, just the quiet, brilliant patience of a man who had always known he would win.
In the end, he told the editor, he had held it as long as he could, carried it through the changed boarding houses and the counted drinks and the watchful, sleepless nights. And then one morning his nerves simply presented him with the bill, and the bill was larger than he could pay alone.
He went to Traherne and told him everything. "That's a good story," the editor said immediately. "Make 200 of it. Fake the name, of course. Can't mention Hensig or we'll have a libel suit on our hands." Williams stared at him. He insisted, he pressed. He explained with a force that surprised even himself, entirely in earnest. And Traherne, young, sharp, perpetually moving, with the instincts of a man who had learned to read people the way other men read copy, looked at him for one assessing moment and took him into the glass-doored office. "See here, Williams," he said it kindly but without softening. "You're drinking too much. That's the size of it. Steady up on the wash, and Hensig's face will disappear." Williams told him with some heat that the face was not a symptom of delirium tremens. Traherne gave him 2 more minutes, which for a man with a crowd of reporters waiting at the news desk was a considerable gift. "So," his interest sharpened slightly. "Well, I guess Hensig's simply trying to razzle-dazzle you. You tried to kill him with your reports, and now he wants to scare you by way of return. But he'll never dare do anything real. Throw him a good bluff and he'll fold like a baby. Everything in this world is pretense." A brief pause. "Though I do rather like the idea of the germs. That's original." Williams told him about the senator, about the dock, about the overcoat. Maybe, Traherne said, already moving. "But the senator drinks Chinese whiskey, and a man who does that might imagine anything on God's earth. Take a tip from an old hand, let up on the wash, and Hensig's face will disappear." He had dug a few coins out of his pocket and threw them towards Traherne's desk, then was already at the door. "Next time you see this German, go up and ask him for an interview. What does it feel like to escape the chair? Just like that, casual. Then tell him he's a suspected man, that he's being watched, that you're doing him a favor by warning him. Turn the tables, make him the one who has to think about it." He looked back once. "See?" Then he was gone, back into the noise of the news desk, and Williams was alone with the advice and the fear and the question of whether they were compatible. He came down the office steps into the street, thought about the rapid transit commissioners, thought about the meeting he was supposed to cover, thought briefly about Traherne's advice and whether he had the nerve to use it if the moment came. Then the moment came, at the bottom of the steps. No warning, no transition. One instant he was moving through an ordinary morning, and the next he was face to face with Max Hensig, close enough that stopping was impossible, close enough that there was no time to swerve, to choose a direction, to do anything except arrive at this moment that he had been dreading for weeks, and find himself standing in it. His head swam. His hands began to tremble. He felt it all, every week of fear, every sleepless night, every counted drink and changed route and rearranged habit arriving simultaneously in his body, asking to be expressed as the one thing he absolutely could not afford: running. He held himself still. And then from somewhere beneath the fear, from the part of him that had been a reporter long enough to act under pressure before the mind had finished deciding, something steadied. Not courage exactly, something more mechanical than courage, the last piece of advice he had been given rising to the surface simply because it was the only plan available. He looked at Hensig and did not run.
Hensig looked prosperous. That was the first thing Williams registered. The fur overcoat, the cap, the general appearance of a man for whom things had been going well. And then the face beneath the fur, white as ever, whiter perhaps, and the blue eyes burning in it with a light that had nothing to do with warmth. "Why, Dr. Hensig, you're back in New York." He heard his own voice come out steadier than he deserved. "When did you arrive? I'm glad, I suppose. I mean..." The sentence disintegrated.
He caught what was left of it and made the only offer his panicking mind could produce. "Will you come and have a drink?" He knew, even as he said it, how it sounded. Foolish, desperate, the last resort of a man whose preparation had evaporated on contact with the actual thing. But the one imperative, the one thing above all others, was that Hensig should not know he was afraid. "I think not, Mr. Vulture reporter. Thanks." The self-possession was absolute, as it always was. "But I sit by and watch you drink." Williams seized on the refusal like a door left open and moved through it, something about a meeting, a commitment, the press of the day's work. "I walk a little way with you, perhaps," Hensig said, and fell into step beside him. There was nothing to be done about it. They crossed into City Hall Park as the dusk came down, moving into the thick of the late afternoon crowd, that particular New York crowd of people in violent motion, everyone going somewhere at speed, the whole park a churning current of bodies and noise and urgency, everyone in a hurry, everyone pushing forward, except Hensig. He walked beside Williams with the unhurried calm of a man strolling through an empty garden. The city moved around him and left him untouched. He carried something with him, an atmosphere, cold and self-contained, that seemed to hold the chaos at a slight remove. His mind was present in his eyes, alert, watchful, entirely sure of itself. Williams kept his hands in his overcoat pockets, the check ulster, he noted with a cold flash, the same coat, and watched his companion sideways with the peripheral attention of a man who cannot afford to look directly at what frightens him. "Living in New York again?" "Not as a doctor anymore," Hensig walked, considered. "I now teach and study. Also I write scientific books a little." "About what?" He turned and looked at Williams, and smiled. "Germs," he said. "Disease germs, their culture and development." Williams walked faster. He thought of Treherne's advice, the bluff, the turned tables, the interview request, and reached for it with both hands. "You'd care to give me an interview sometime on your special subjects?" "Oh yes, with much pleasure. I live in Harlem now, if you will call one day." "Our office is better," Williams said immediately. "Paper, desks, library, all on hand." Hensig paused for a fraction of a second, then, "If you're afraid—" He stopped, let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished, doing more work that way than it would have completed. Then with a laugh, "I have no arsenic there. You don't think me any more a bungling poisoner? You have changed your mind about all that?" The flesh along William's arms moved. His own wife. The man was speaking of his own wife, the woman in the ground, the exhumed body, the arsenic in the tissue, with the breezy ease of a man referencing a professional misunderstanding that had since been cleared up. He stopped walking. The crowd split around them, two streams deflecting past on either side, the city continuing without them. He turned and faced Hensig directly, fully, deliberately, and stood still in the moving current of people, because there was something that needed to be said, and it needed to be said while looking the man in the eye, and it needed to be convincing. He was not afraid. He had to make him believe that. He was not entirely sure he believed it himself.
"I suppose you're aware, Dr. Hensig, that the police know you've returned." He kept his voice low and level, forcing his eyes to hold the other man's. "That you're being watched, probably. And why not, pray? They may suspect something. Suspected already again?" A sound that was almost amusement. "Ach was! I only wish to warn you. No policeman sees what I do," Hensig said. The laugh that followed it was not a social sound, "or catches me again, but I thank you all the same." A Broadway car came past at full speed. Williams turned and ran for it. He could not stand another minute, not another second of those eyes, that voice, that atmosphere of cold and patient amusement. He caught the car and swung aboard and did not look back. Behind him, growing smaller in the crowd, "I call at the office one day to give you the interview." Then the city swallowed him. The white face disappeared into the flow of bodies and motion and noise, as though it had never been there, as though it was simply part of the city now, dissolved into it, moving through it, invisible and present and waiting. Williams stood on the car and trembled, not visibly, inside where it mattered. He covered the rapid transit board meeting mechanically. His hand moved, his pencil recorded. The commissioners spoke, and he wrote down what they said with the automatic competence of a man who has done something so many times that the body can manage it without the mind. His mind was elsewhere entirely. Hensig was beside him the whole time, not physically, but present in the way that certain thoughts are present, occupying the foreground, refusing to be pushed back, insisting on their reality with a persistence that made the commissioners and their proceedings feel like scenery in someone else's story. He turned it over with the cold clarity that fear at a certain pitch produces. Not panic, something more functional than panic. Assessment. Hensig hated him. That was established. He would act on that hatred, eventually, when the right moment presented itself. He would not shoot. He would not use anything crude or traceable or detectable. He had said so much himself, through prison bars, with the academic satisfaction of a man who has already solved the problem. He would simply follow, watch, wait, and then a moment of proximity, a crowd, a jostling in a corridor, a hand passing close in a restaurant, and the scratch, so small it might not even be felt, and in the blood, immediately, invisibly, the germ, cultivated to a virulence that no medicine could reach, introduced and gone before the body knew it had been entered. Germs. The word sat in his mind like a splinter. And the cruelest part, the part that pressed hardest against his thoughts, was the aftermath. If he fell ill, suddenly and severely, what would anyone say? Only that he had caught something in the course of his work. He moved through the worst of the city daily, the slums, the hospitals, the morgues, the cells, the foreign quarters where disease moved through crowded rooms like a slow and patient tenant. Of course he had caught a fever. Of course. What else would it be? There was no story he could tell a magistrate, no case he could bring to the police, nothing that would survive the first question, "What evidence do you have?" He had a feeling. He had a doctor's words spoken through bars months ago to a reporter who drank too much and a history of nervous imagination. He had a push in the dark at a fire scene that might have been an accident. He had a face glimpsed on a steamer. He had nothing. He went to the senator that evening, his only real friend in the entire city, the one person who had been there from the beginning, who had gone over the edge of a dock in a borrowed overcoat and come back with blood on his forehead and the name on his lips. He said it quietly, without drama, because it needed to be said and there was no one else to say it to. "If I get suddenly ill and send for you, look carefully for a scratch on my body, anywhere, any scratch at all." He held the senator's eyes. "Tell Dowling and tell the doctor everything, the whole story." The senator looked at him for a long moment, said nothing, which, in its own way, was the most frightening response he could have given.
"You think Hensig goes about with a little bottle of plague germs in his vest pocket?" The senator laughed, "ready to scratch you with a pin? Some scheme like that, I'm sure of it. Nothing could be proved anyway. He wouldn't keep the evidence on him till he was arrested, would he?" Williams said nothing, because the senator was right, and that was precisely the problem. In the 2 weeks that followed, he ran into Hensig twice.
The first time was outside his own boarding house, the new one, the one he had moved to specifically so that no one could find him. 8 o'clock in the evening, the hall light falling through the open door onto the front steps, and there was Hensig, 1 foot already on the stone, as though he had been about to come up. The moment their eyes might have met, he turned his face away and moved on down the street. Smooth, unhurried, as though he had simply changed his mind about something. As though he had been there before. As though he knew exactly where the new boarding house was. The second time was less certain. Williams was covering a suspicious death case in the courts, a woman as the chief prisoner, and in the crowd at the back of the room he thought he saw the white face, watching, still, directed at him with the familiar, patient attention. He looked away for a moment, looked back, gone. He searched the lobby afterward, the corridor. Nothing, no sign. Which was, in its own way, worse than finding him. That same day, Dowling appeared in the building, plain clothes now, promoted, moving through the world with the satisfied energy of a man whose instincts have been officially validated. He pulled Williams into a corner. We're watching him too. Low, quick, the voice of a man enjoying himself. Nothing you can use yet, but he's changed his name again, calls himself Schmidt now, dropped the doctor, never stays at the same address more than a week or two. He paused for effect. I'm pretty sure he's Brunner, the man Berlin's been looking for. 2 murders. He's a holy terror if ever there was one. Williams told him about the boarding house steps, about the face in the courtroom that disappeared, about the overcoat and the dock and the push in the dark. Dowling listened with the focused pleasure of a man assembling something. That's dead likely, he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, with the casual ease of someone mentioning the weather, I guess we'll have to make some kind of case against him anyway, just to get him out of the way. He's dangerous to have hunting loose. Williams walked out into the street and tried to find something in those words that felt like reassurance. He found very little. Fear is patient. That is the thing about it that no one tells you, that it does not arrive all at once, does not announce itself at the door and demand to be dealt with. It comes in increments. It settles in layers, each one thin enough to be dismissed individually, until one morning you wake and discover that the layers have accumulated into something structural, something load-bearing, something that has quietly become the architecture of every day. Williams had been drinking again, heavily, and with the particular desperation of a man using alcohol not for pleasure, but for function, to dull the edges, to quiet the part of his mind that ran the same calculations on a loop. It wasn't working as well as it used to. The cocktails had multiplied. The sleep had thinned. The nerves had reached a state that he could no longer will himself past. He thought about what he would do if he met Hensig now, face to face, close, alone. He could not answer the question with any confidence. He might lunge at him. Fear at a certain pitch converts to violence without warning, bypasses judgment entirely, and puts the hands in motion before the mind has voted. He had seen it in other men. He understood it now from the inside. Or he might do nothing, might simply stand there, caught in those blue eyes, while every intention drained out of him, and left only the stillness of a small animal that has run out of directions. He did not know which. And not knowing was, in its own way, the most frightening thing of all.
He knew it was coming, not as a fear, not anymore, as a fact. The way you know your next birthday is coming, the way you know winter follows autumn, certain, scheduled, indifferent to what you wanted. He could change boarding houses again. He could leave New York entirely, take a train to another city, start over somewhere that had never heard the name Hensig. It would buy time. That was all it would buy. The final accounting between them was not a question of if, only when. Sunday was always the worst day. The assignments were thankless. Private interviews with citizens who performed resentment at being disturbed on their day of rest, the whole business conducted with a mutual pretense that neither party was obligated to be there. And then the evening, the Brooklyn church, the difficult sermon with its rapid delivery and its endless quotations, and only a column and a half to contain it all. His shorthand strained to keep pace. He usually left after 9:30 with his hand aching and the transcription still ahead of him. This particular Sunday, he was at his small table directly beneath the pulpit, condensing as he went, his pencil moving in the automatic shorthand of a man whose body is working while his mind is elsewhere, when he looked up. Just a pause, just a moment's rest for the eyes during a break in the sermon. He let his gaze move over the congregation, up to the galleries, the crowded front row, and there he was, Hensig, watching him with a smile that had no business being in a church, that had no business being on any human face, fixed and still and directed at Williams with the patient proprietary attention of a man observing something that belongs to him. The next sentence of the sermon disappeared entirely. Williams' pencil moved for the remainder of the service out of muscle memory alone. When he transcribed his notes at the office afterward, the shorthand from those final minutes was illegible. His hand had been writing without him. It was past 1 a.m. when he finished. He walked out into the night and went directly to the all-night drugstore on the corner, the one with the back room, the password, the liquor that appeared without a license and disappeared without a record. He drank more than usual. He talked longer than necessary with the man who ran the back room. He stretched the time out deliberately, generously, with the particular inventiveness of a man finding reasons to stay somewhere he doesn't especially want to be. He knew why. He was not dishonest enough with himself to pretend otherwise. He was afraid of the walk home. The lower end of New York after midnight was a different city, emptied of the noise and mass that made it feel safe during the day, reduced to its bones. No residences, no theaters, a few travelers off late ferries, a scattering of policemen moving through their circuits, the permanent population of ne'er-do-wells who lived in the doorways of saloons and watched the street with the patient expertise of people who have nowhere else to be. Park Row still burned with light and motion. The newspaper world never fully slept. But one step outside that narrow, bright corridor, and the darkness closed in with a completeness that felt deliberate. Empty streets, poor lighting, long blocks between one human presence and the next. A scratch, a pin, a moment of proximity in the dark. He ordered another drink. He stayed until he could no longer reasonably stay. Then he put on his coat, stepped out of the light, and walked into the city's dark and waiting silence.
He thought about a cab. $3. He turned it over, weighed it against the dark street and the face in the gallery, and dismissed it. Extravagant. He was a reporter on a salary, not a man who took cabs because he was frightened of the dark. He looked through the colored glass of the drugstore window into the street outside. Empty, as far as he could tell. Then Galusha Owen came in, too drunk to stand straight, too far gone to be of any use as a company, and heading to Harlem besides, which was miles past anywhere Williams needed to go. He ordered another rye, his fourth. He held it and looked at the window and tightened something inside himself the way you tighten a loose wire. One more twist, one more degree of tension, and then he put the glass down, went to the door, and launched himself through it in something between a stride and a run, taking the steps in a single flying movement. And hit a man full in the chest. His fists came up before he knew they were moving. "Where's your hurry?" said a familiar voice, laughing. "Is the Prince of Wales dead?" The senator. Williams stood on the pavement and breathed. The relief was so complete and so physical that for a moment he said nothing at all, just stood there in the cold night air with his heart still running and his fists slowly lowering, looking at his friend's broad, honest, cheerfully bewildered face. "Come in and have a drink," he managed, "then walk home with me."
Inside, over the last round, he told the senator about the gallery, the fixed stare, the smile. He'd never sit through a whole sermon just to watch you, the senator said with the reasonable tone of a man trying to be helpful. He'd take any trouble in the world to gain his end. He said it quietly, without heat, the flat certainty of a man stating something he has had weeks to verify. He's mapping my movements, my habits, every one of them. He doesn't take chances on something like this. A pause. I'd bet he's not far away right now. Rats, the senator said, and laughed, but the laugh had something slightly forced in it, the laugh of a man who isn't entirely sure he disagrees. Have another rye. They went out together. City Hall Park, diagonal across to Broadway, then north. Canal Street, Grand Street, badly lit, nearly deserted, the city reduced to its skeleton at this hour. A few drunken shapes moving at the edges. Policemen on corners, stationed, as always, conveniently close to saloon side doors, calling good night as the two reporters passed. The senator stayed close, that solid, reliable presence, the cart-horse warmth of him, and the whiskey was doing its modest work, and the occasional lamp and the occasional uniform combined to lift Williams's spirits by small, measurable degrees. By 14th Street, the city had come back to life. Better lighting, actual traffic, Union Square visible ahead with its familiar geometry, his own street just beyond. The darkness had thinned. The walk had been walked. He felt for the first time in hours something approaching ordinary. "Good night." The senator stopped at the corner, cheerful and solid as always. "Get home safe. I turn off here." He paused for just a moment, the way people pause when they want to ask something without quite asking it. "You feel all right?" Williams laughed, a real laugh, loose and genuine, the whiskey and the safe arrival combining into something almost like lightness. "I may get double rates for an exclusive if you come on and watch me get assaulted." The senator laughed back, and Williams turned to watch him go, that broad, familiar figure moving away into the side street, growing smaller, the check of his coat catching the lamplight once, twice, and then disappearing around the corner. The street ahead was quiet. 1 block, maybe 2. He was almost home.
The moment the senator turned the corner, the laughter stopped, not gradually, instantly, as though it had only ever been borrowed and the lender had just called it back. He crossed the square quickly, moving through the trees, his eyes doing the work his legs were pretending not to need, scanning the benches, the shadows between lamps, the shapes of the men who slept in parks because they had nowhere else to be. Nothing, nothing visible. A few more minutes and he would be inside, behind a locked door, in the small back bedroom that was the closest thing he had to safety. He could see Burbacher's across the way, warm light, respectable Germans playing chess over Rhine wine at this hour, the particular civilized calm of a place that had never heard of Max Hensig. He thought about going in, hesitated, kept walking. Then he reached the end of the square and saw it. East 18th Street, dark, the mouth of it opening between 2 buildings like something that had been waiting, the lamplight stopping at the threshold as though it knew better than to go further, and beyond it only the deep, specific darkness of a street with something in it. He stopped, told himself he would go back for one more drink, turned around. And it was only on the way back, with the whiskey and the hour and the long night pressing on his thinking, that the truth arrived without ceremony. He had turned around because he was afraid of what the dark street was hiding. Not a feeling, a fact. If there had been a lamp at that corner, he would have walked straight through without a second thought. He was still processing this when he saw the figure. It had come out of the dark mouth of the street, the exact darkness he had refused to enter, and was moving behind him now,
close to the buildings, using every railing, every shadow, every degree of cover the street provided, moving with the quiet, practiced economy of something that has done this before. Williams kept walking, toward Burbacher's, toward the light. The figure kept pace. Then the bright section of pavement, the wine-room windows throwing their warm rectangle onto the street, and in that light, without turning, he knew the man was directly behind him, close, the small, silent run of the last few yards. He turned. Slim, dark hair, blue eyes. The hair was dyed. It didn't matter. Nothing about the alteration of surface details could change what lived beneath them. That white face, that particular quality of attention, that expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to arrive. "It's very late to be coming home. I thought I recognized my reporter friend from the Vulture." What he heard, underneath the pleasant words, in the frequency beneath the frequency, was something else entirely. "At last, you are exhausted and broken, and I can do what I please with you." Because that was the truth of it. That was what the face said, what the voice said, what the dyed hair and the careful tracking through shadows and the knowledge of his exact movements on this exact night all said together. A gun he could have faced, a raised fist, any direct and legible threat. Those things had grammar, had rules, had a shape the mind could organize itself around. But this slim, pale, almost gentle figure, with his terrible patience and his specific cruelty, produced a terror that bypassed every rational defense and went straight to the root. He felt like a man the morning of his execution. The hysterical surges, the inability to fix his thoughts on anything solid, the horrible, helpless clarity of a situation that has no good exit. And then he heard his own voice, coming from somewhere outside the fear, from the professional reflex that had been trained so long it operated independently of everything else. "I was going to have a drink before turning in." A gulp, a laugh that didn't quite sound like one. "Will you join me?"
He understood afterward why he had said it. Not courage, not quick thinking, one single clear imperative rising through the fog of whiskey and terror. Whatever happens, he must not know you are afraid. That was all. That was the whole of it. The invitation came from that, from the last functioning part of his professional self, the part that had learned, over years of difficult interviews and dangerous rooms, that the appearance of composure is sometimes the only weapon available. So they walked, side by side, down the street, together. And Williams felt the man's will beside him like a physical pressure, steady, persistent, moving against him like a current moves against a swimmer. Not violent, not dramatic, simply constant. His own thoughts had come loose from their moorings. They floated somewhere outside his skull, scattered, refusing to organize themselves into anything useful. He could not think of a single thing to say. "A glass of lager, perhaps?" Hensig said pleasantly. "I take that with you." He made a small gesture toward his hair, his mustache, the dyed dark covering over the flaxen. "You know me in spite of—" He left it unfinished, which was worse than completing it. "Also, I give you now the interview you asked for, if you like." Williams heard himself agree, heard his own voice produce something feeble and approximate. He turned and looked at the man beside him, really looked, helplessly, the way you look when you have stopped being able to look away, and felt the accumulated weight of every week since the trial settle down through him and compress around his heart. A bird, he thought, running finally into the open jaws of the thing that has been watching it. He understood what was happening. That was the particular cruelty of it. He understood completely, and understanding changed nothing. This was Hensig's plan, had always been Hensig's plan, and he was walking inside it now with the docile cooperation of a man who has been maneuvered so carefully that resistance has become geometrically impossible. Whatever came next, a touch, a scratch, a briefest contact, something so small it might not even register as it happened, would be the thing. Delivered here, tonight, when he was exhausted and drink-fuddled, and his nerves had been worn to their last threads by weeks of precise, patient preparation. The alcohol moved in his ears like a tide. He felt the pavement under his feet and kept walking. But underneath the fog, underneath the fear and the whiskey and the scattered thoughts, something else was happening, something quieter and more structural. He grasped it dimly, the way a drowning man grasps something solid in dark water without being able to see what it is. Two things, fundamental. The first, he was not finished yet. The paralysis he felt now was not permanent. It was accumulating. Fear at this pitch does not hold its level indefinitely. It builds to a point, a saturation point, and at that point something changes. The pendulum reaches the end of its arc and swings back. The coward, pressed past the last boundary of endurance, sometimes becomes capable of a violence and precision that no ordinarily brave man could match, because he has nothing left to lose, because the fear has burned through everything and left behind it a terrible clarity. He was not there yet, but the moment was coming. And so, the second thing, following from the first, do not spend what you have left on half measures. Do not waste the last reserves of will on small resistances that change nothing. Play dead. Let the fear run its course. Let it build to the point where it becomes something else entirely. Wait for the pendulum. Then use everything. He walked beside his executioner through the empty streets and said nothing and waited.
Somewhere beneath the whiskey and the fear, beneath the scattered thoughts and the mechanical footsteps and the performance of a calm he didn't feel, something was still working. Not his conscious mind. That was compromised, fuddled, running in circles. Something deeper. The part of a man that operates below the surface of what he knows about himself. The part that takes over when the upper layers have been stripped away by extremity. It was guiding him now, quietly and without explanation, the way a current guides a swimmer who has stopped fighting it. And what it told him was this: do not resist, not yet. Agree to everything. Yield on every small point. Waste nothing on friction over details that will be surrendered anyway. Every atom of will he spent on half measures now was an atom he would not have when the moment came. And the moment was coming. He could feel it gathering somewhere ahead of him in the dark, the way you feel a storm before the sky changes. Play dead. Let the pendulum swing. His weakness, he understood dimly, might even work in his favor, might make him look more broken than he was, might make Hensig careless in the way that predators become careless when the prey has stopped moving. And the second thing, stranger and more precise, the drinking. He needed more. Not to oblivion. The frontier between clarity and unconsciousness was narrow, and he understood this with an accuracy that surprised him, as though some sober part of him had calculated it in advance. But up to that frontier and not beyond it, additional whiskey would do something useful, silence the fear, quiet the surface thoughts, and release whatever was waiting underneath. The drunken mind, at a certain exact pitch, becomes something other than drunk, becomes luminous, capable, stripped of the hesitations and second-guessings that ordinary sobriety imposes. He had been there before, accidentally.
He needed to get there deliberately and stop precisely when he arrived. His escape then, if escape was possible, depended on two things arriving simultaneously: the fear reaching its saturation point and becoming something else, and the whiskey reaching its clarifying pitch and stopping there. 2 clocks, both running. He had to read them both correctly. He kept walking. They talked as they went, in the way of two men who happened to be heading the same direction, or in the way of one man performing that fiction for the benefit of the other. Hensig was easy, conversational, the voice of an agreeable acquaintance on a late-night stroll, carrying beneath its pleasantness the absolute certainty of a man who knows his prey is secured and finds the struggling mildly entertaining. He laughed about the hair, the dyed dark covering over the flaxen, the transformation that fooled no one. A woman had suggested it. She told him it would look younger. He said it with a lightness that was almost charming. Williams listened and nodded and agreed and waited. The street moved beneath his feet. The night pressed in from all sides. Somewhere ahead, in a saloon that was still lit, a glass was waiting. The precise, calibrated glass that was either the one that saved him or the one that finished him. He would have to judge exactly right. He kept walking.
The story about the woman was a lie. Williams knew it the moment he heard it. The police had more to do with the dyed hair than any woman's preference, but the vanity in the explanation was real, and it was interesting. A small, vivid crack in the surface. A man who kills with the precision of a scientist and cannot resist preening about his appearance. He filed it away somewhere and kept walking. Burbiture's was refused. Hensig knew the owner paid no protection money and might be raided. He knew this the way a man knows the layout of a neighborhood he has been moving through carefully for weeks. "I know a nice quiet place on 3rd Avenue. We go there." Williams turned with him down the side street. He thought, without quite meaning to, of the men he had watched walking the short corridor from the cell to the chair at Sing Sing. The particular quality of those last steps, mechanical, inevitable, the body continuing because stopping was no longer an option. He had always wondered what they felt. Now he thought he understood. Hensig talked as they walked. A new discovery in bacteriology. Important, he said, groundbreaking, exclusive for the vulture as a gift to a friend. Technical language followed. Toxins, alkaloids, the vocabulary of a science that had, in this man's hands, become something else entirely. Williams's mind moved through the words without catching on any of them. What he registered clearly, the one thing that cut through the fog, was the tone, the absolute, unhurried certainty of a man who has already arrived at the outcome and is simply filling the time pleasantly until it materializes. When Williams lurched, the drink and the fear combining badly in his legs, Hensig took his arm. The touch of those fingers. It required everything he had not to strike out blindly, not to scream, not to do something that would end this prematurely and badly. He absorbed it, kept walking, stored it. 3rd Avenue, a side door, the name Schubacher above the porch, the lights out except a faint glow through the fanlight. A face appeared at the half-open door, cautious, assessing, and then they were inside with a whispered instruction to keep quiet. The front room was what it was, a Tammany saloon running after hours on a monthly understanding with the police, provided no one bled on the floor. A dozen men at the bar, unpleasant of face and purpose, a single lamp doing the minimum required. The bartender's eyes found Hensig with the brief flicker of recognition. "Come," Hensig said quietly. "We go to the back room. I know the password." He said it with a laugh. Through the door at the far end of the bar, the world changed, brighter, louder, thicker. A dozen tables, most of them occupied. Men drinking with painted women, voices raised in argument or song, or the particular volume of people who have stopped caring what hour it is. Smoke hanging in layers, the smell of spilled rye and cheap perfume, and the specific human warmth of a room that has been closed too long. No one looked up. Hensig led him to the corner table farthest from the door. His choice, naturally. The table with the best view of the room and the most distance from the exit. Williams sat. The waiter came, was nehmen die Herren, and Williams ordered rye whiskey, and when it came he swallowed it without the soda chaser and raised his hand for another before the glass was fully down. The clock was running. He needed to get to the right place and stop there. He was still too afraid, too scattered. Not yet. He waited for the second glass and felt the first one moving through him like a slow tide, and watched Hensig across the table, calm, proprietary, entirely at ease, and thought about pendulums.
"It's awfully watered," Williams said, hearing the thickness in his own voice. "And I'm tired. Cocaine, under the circumstances, would help you quicker, perhaps." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. He kept his face still, kept his hands still, but inside, in the place where the fear lived and the scattered thoughts circled, something went very cold. The drugstore on First Avenue, the bottle, the specific, private, carefully concealed habit that he had never discussed with anyone in the world. Hensig knew, had known apparently for some time, had been on his trail not for days but for weeks, following him home from the office, tracking his routes, learning the pharmacist, learning the bottle, learning everything, every night, every movement, the whole architecture of his private life mapped and memorized by those cold blue eyes. He swallowed it, said nothing, ordered another whiskey. "Then we finish quickly if you are tired. Tomorrow you show me your report for corrections if you make mistakes. I give you the address tonight before we leave." The accent was thickening, the precision of his English fraying slightly at the edges. Williams had noticed this before, the way the man's speech deteriorated as his excitement grew, the surface control developing hairline cracks. He filed it away and drank. He clinked glasses with the man who intended to kill him, swallowed half the glass without water, called for another, watched over the rim as Hensig merely tasted his own, barely a sip, the glass held more as a prop than a drink, those eyes steady and attentive and entirely sober above the performance. "I can write shorthand," Williams offered, trying for the tone of a man at ease. "Ach, I know, of course." Of course. There was a mirror behind the table. While Hensig reached into his coat for papers, Williams used it, a quick, practiced sweep of the room, the kind of scan a reporter learns to make without appearing to make it. What he saw did not comfort him. Degraded faces, besotted faces, men and women who had arrived at this hour of this morning by roads that had not been kind to them, wearing the evidence of it in every feature. Not one face in the room to which he could appeal with any reasonable expectation of help. And yet, he found with a clarity that surprised him that he preferred every single one of them to the face across the table. Every blurred, brutish, drink-ruined face in that room was at least human, was at least operating within the recognizable territory of human failure, human weakness, human damage. Hensig was something outside that territory entirely, something that had never been inside it. And this preference for the degraded over the monstrous, for the low over the inhuman, arrived in his mind as a sharp, sudden, almost physical conviction of what exactly he was sitting across from. He emptied his glass, ordered it filled again. But something was changing,
quietly, incrementally, the way light changes in the hour before dawn, not dramatic, not sudden, but real and directional. The fog was thinning, not lifting entirely, but thinning, a degree of clarity returning to the edges of his thinking, the faintest stirring of something that, if he was careful, if he did not push past the frontier, might become will. The fear was still there, but the alcohol at this precise pitch was beginning to do the thing he had calculated it would do, was beginning to insulate the fear rather than amplify it, to put a thin wall between the terror and the thinking, to give the thinking room to move. He was not drunk in the ordinary sense. The fear had been burning the alcohol as fast as it arrived, keeping him strangely, dangerously functional. Under normal circumstances, he would have been on the floor 2 glasses ago. Tonight, the emotion and the whiskey were counterbalancing each other, and in the narrow space between them, that precise, temporary, precarious equilibrium, something was gathering itself. He could feel the moment approaching. Not here yet, but coming. He had to reach it without crossing past it. 1 glass too many, and the whole calculation collapsed. The clarity would tip into unconsciousness, the gathering will dissolve, and whatever Hensig intended would happen to a man who could no longer prevent it. He watched the papers come out of the coat pocket across the table. He waited. He drank with the careful precision of a man defusing something.
The crash came from behind him. He felt it before he heard it, the vibration through the floor, then the sound, then the instinctive lurch of every nerve in his body. He steadied himself and used the mirror. A middle-aged man, drunk past his own management, had slid from his chair and was now a heap on the floor. 2 women were beside him immediately, ostensibly helping, actually working. Their hands moved through his pockets with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this many times and feel no particular way about it. In the corner, a large man who had been asleep for most of the evening opened his eyes, registered the scene, laughed once, and closed them again. No one moved to intervene. This was not a place where intervention was the custom. Williams watched it in the mirror and thought, with the strange sideways clarity that was beginning to arrive in him, knockout drops, that's all that is. The women, the pocket work, the collapsed man, crude, ordinary, almost domestic in its way. Hensig's method would be nothing like that. A scratch, a pin, a germ cultivated to a virulence no medicine could reach, introduced in a second, in a crowd, in a moment of manufactured contact, clean, invisible, leaving nothing behind but a man who got sick and then got sicker and then stopped. He pulled his attention back to the table. "I have some notes of my discovery," Hensig said, smiling faintly at the interruption with the patience of a man who has all night. He produced papers from an inner pocket. "But they are written in German, so I translate for you. You have paper and pencil?" Williams produced his copy paper, set it flat on the table, prepared to write. And so the performance continued. The elevated trains rattled past outside in irregular bursts. The room maintained its noise, drunken conversation, the occasional smash of glass, the particular human din of people who have stopped caring about the hour. Against all of it, Hensig's voice moved steadily, precisely, translating and explaining his discovery in that accented, insistent cadence, the words technical and deliberate. Williams wrote, or appeared to write. His hand moved, his eyes stayed on the paper, his mind was somewhere else entirely. The room was emptying. Gradually, table by table, the night was ceding to early morning. New arrivals had stopped arriving. The waiter dozed in his chair by the door. The large man in the corner still snored with the commitment of someone who had made a decision and intended to honor it. When he left, the proprietor would close. That moment was approaching. He could feel it in the thinning of the room's noise, in the lengthening silences between the elevated trains. Hensig felt it too. Williams could see it in him, the slight increase of attentiveness, the eyes moving more frequently to the door, to the sleeping man, to Williams's glass. He was encouraging the drinking now, openly, without subtlety, watching the gradual accumulation of effect with a satisfaction he no longer troubled to conceal. He held his victim too securely to feel the need for concealment. When the last man left, when they were briefly, completely alone, it would take a second, less than a second. He was becoming careless. That was the crack. Williams saw it and said nothing, and filed it in the part of his mind that was sharpening, degree by careful degree, towards something usable. Because the will was returning. Not loudly, not in a rush, the way a tide returns, imperceptibly at first, then undeniably. Each glass had moved him closer to the precise pitch he needed, and he could feel the approach of it the way you feel a change in air pressure. Something in the quality of his thinking, the edges of his perception, the steadying of the scattered thoughts into something that was beginning to resemble intention. With the clarity came the fear, sharper now, more focused, more real. That was the paradox of it. The clearer his mind became, the more completely he understood his position, and the more completely he understood his position, the more acutely he felt the terror. The two things were climbing together, feeding each other, building toward the same point. The saturation point, the culminating moment. They were close, both of them, coming within reach now, the way a destination comes within reach after a very long walk, still ahead, but no longer abstract. He drank, he wrote, he waited. Hensig translated his discovery into the copy paper between them, his voice steady and almost warm, his eyes bright with the private knowledge of what came next. And Williams sat across from him and gathered himself in secret and waited for the pendulum to reach the top of its arc.
It came, not all at once, in stages, the way a lens comes into focus, the way a sound resolves from noise into something with meaning. The stupid, passive terror that had held him for the last hour began to move, to change its nature, to convert itself from the kind of fear that paralyzes into the kind that sharpens. The alcohol had found its precise pitch and was holding there, burning at the hidden centers of his mind, illuminating things that were normally dark. He became observant, then critical, then alert in a way that had nothing to do with ordinary wakefulness. A heightened, almost supernatural clarity that spread outward from his thinking into his skin, the fine hairs on the back of his hands. He could hear the room without looking at it. He could feel Hensig's intentions moving across the table like heat from a lamp. It was as though the other man's mind had become a clock whose mechanism he could hear ticking, the small, precise clicks of calculation, of timing, of a man measuring the distance between now and the moment he had been building toward all evening. He was almost clairvoyant, and he knew it would last only minutes. The frontier was that narrow. Already his fingers had gone. The shorthand on the paper bore no resemblance to any system ever invented, a wild scrawl that looked like the writing of a man much further gone than he was, which was, he understood, with the cold precision of his current state, exactly right. He exaggerated it, thickened his speech, let his head drop a fraction more than necessary, performed collapse with the careful craft of a man who is sober than he has ever been in his life. And Hensig believed it. He could feel the belief moving across the table, the slight relaxation, the increased carelessness, the face allowing itself an expression it had kept controlled all evening, exultant, openly, unmistakably exultant. The face of a man who has arrived at the end of a long patience and is allowing himself finally to feel the pleasure of it. He was a little deceived. A little was enough. Williams had stopped hearing the words some time ago. The scientific language, the discovery, the translation, it was noise, always had been, a performance designed to occupy him while the real work was done. He caught the ends of phrases occasionally and produced blundering questions from them, and Hensig answered at length, watching the foolish hieroglyphics multiply on the copy paper with visible satisfaction. Because the whole thing was a blind. There was no discovery. There had never been a discovery. The technical language was jargon, carefully assembled, utterly meaningless, designed to fill time and paper while a man drank himself past the point of resistance. Those shorthand notes would never be transcribed. Hensig knew it. He would be gone, clean, untraceable, already on the other side of whatever name he was currently using, long before his victim's senses cleared enough to understand what had been introduced into his blood. A scratch, so small it might have been nothing, a pin drawn across skin in a moment of manufactured contact, a steadying hand on a lurching arm, a brush of fingers passing paper, anything. And in the blood, immediately and invisibly, the germ, cultivated past the reach of medicine, doing its quiet, brilliant, patient work. Williams understood all of this with perfect clarity, and he sat very still and scrawled his meaningless shorthand and performed his collapse, and felt the power in him reaching its apex, that narrow, luminous, temporary peak where everything was possible and nothing was wasted. The big man in the corner shifted in his sleep. The waiter's head dropped further toward his chest. The room was almost empty. The moment was almost here.
He felt it before he understood it. Not a sound, not a movement, something subtler than either, a shift in the quality of the air between them, a change in the frequency of Hensig's attention, as though a clock that had been winding had reached the point where the spring was fully coiled. It came to Williams as sound, though there was no sound. A gong struck somewhere below the level of hearing, reverberating through the bones rather than the ears. Hensig's scheme had moved forward a step. The fear doubled, instantly, without warning, brimmed up toward the breaking point, toward the edge where it would tip from asset to catastrophe, where the pendulum would swing past the apex and keep going into the dark. Not yet, not quite yet. He acted on instinct, or something deeper than instinct, that subliminal self that had been guiding him all evening with a wisdom his conscious mind could not have managed. He picked up his glass, emptied it, spilled half of it deliberately down his coat, and laughed. Not a small laugh, a loud, helpless, hopelessly drunken laugh, the laugh of a man who had just remembered something absurd and could not contain it. The image of Wifey Fife rose before him, vivid and ridiculous. The cocktail glasses balanced on the edge of the table at Steve Brody's, each one Steve Brody jumping from the Brooklyn Bridge, each one caught at the last possible moment. He let the laugh out completely. Hensig looked up, and for the first time all evening, the first time in all the weeks since the trial, something moved across his face that was not certainty. A flicker, brief, almost invisible, but real, the expression of a man who has been absolutely sure of something and has just been given a reason, small but genuine, to reconsider. Williams saw it through lowered eyelids.
Suddenly thought of Whitey Fife knocking Steve Brodie off the Brooklyn Bridge in a cocktail glass. You know Whitey Fife, of course, don't you? Hensig's face settled back into its cold purpose. The waiter stirred in his chair by the door, disturbed by the noise. The large man in the corner produced a liquid gulp that threatened to become something worse, then subsided. The room went quiet again, and Hensig resumed his confident survey of the situation. Williams was drunk enough, clearly, easily within reach. The laugh had been the random noise of a man losing his last coherence. That was what he thought. He was wrong. And Williams knew he was wrong, and knowing it was the finest thing he had felt all evening. But the change was real. The perception had not been false. Something was being prepared across the table. He could feel the preparations buzzing in the other man's mind like current through a wire. The moment was coming. Both moments were coming, his and Hensig's, converging toward the same point from opposite directions. He looked at the room with the clear, cold eyes of a man who has arrived, finally, at the place he has been building toward all night. The room was nearly empty. The saloon would close soon. The gray light of early morning was already finding its way through the cracks around the door and shutters, thin and cold and indifferent. The light that ends nights like this one. The gas lamp above them was paling, its amber warmth draining away in the growing gray. The air was thick with everything the night had deposited: stale spirits, cigar smoke, the cheap perfume of the women who had gone hours ago, the sourness of spilled drink and unwashed wood. And across the table, in that paling light, Hensig's face had taken a new quality, something that the dying lamp and the coming dawn combined to reveal rather than conceal. The vileness of it, the absolute inhuman purposefulness, a face that had never, not for the single moment of its existence, contained anything that could be called mercy. Williams looked at it and felt the pendulum reach the top of its arc and begin to move.
The floor was covered in paper. Sheets of it, scattered and absurdly scrawled, the wreckage of a performance that had lasted hours. The table was wet with drink and gray with cigarette ash. His hands were ice. His eyes were burning. His heart moved in his chest like something being struck repeatedly with a soft, insistent hammer. Hensig's voice had changed. It had been changing gradually for the last few minutes, shedding the conversational warmth, the almost pleasantness, the patient academic tone of a man explaining something interesting. What remained was the voice underneath all of that, metallic, precise, the voice of a man who has finally arrived at the thing he came to do. Now, Mr. Vulture Reporter, I show you what I mean all this time to explain. He drew a blank sheet of paper across the table toward him, avoiding the wet patches with careful, unhurried attention to detail. Even now, even here. Lend me your pencil one moment, yes? Williams let his hand move with the exaggerated difficulty of a man barely managing, shoved the pencil across the polished wood as though the effort had cost him most of what remained. His head hung forward, his eyes beneath the weight of his brow watched everything. Hensig began to draw. His touch was firm. There was a smile on his lips. Here is the human arm, he said, the pencil moving with the confidence of a man who has done this before. Nerves, artery, the map of a body laid out on cheap copy paper in a dying saloon at the edge of morning. And here the main nerves, and here the artery. Now my discovery, as I have been explaining. The scientific language resumed, meaningless and fluid, and Williams, with the last of his performance, let his hand fall open and relaxed on the table between them.
He knew what came next. Hensig would take the hand, for illustration, for demonstration, for the half-second of contact that was all he needed. The terror reached its peak, and at the peak, at the exact, precise, long-awaited point of saturation, it stopped being terror and became something else, something cold and clear and purposeful, the pendulum at the top of its arc. The moment he had been building toward all night, through the whiskey and the fear and the performance and the waiting, was here. He did not know yet what form the blow would take. He left it to whatever was operating below his conscious mind, that subliminal self that had guided him all evening with more wisdom than he possessed. He only knew that his strength would hold for exactly long enough, and then he would go down. Hensig dropped the pencil. It didn't fall, it was propelled, sent clattering hard into the corner of the room with the force that made the intention clear. He made no move to retrieve it. Williams made a show of reaching for it, a slow, clumsy, drunken lean toward the floor. "I have another," he said immediately, his hand already moving to his inner pocket. And there it was, long, dark, sharpened at one end, the other covered by a small transparent cap, glass or something like glass, a third of an inch, no more. Williams heard it click against a coat button as it came out, and then in the same motion, so fast that only a man at the precise pitch of abnormal perception could have caught it, the cap came off. The end was free. Something gleamed there in the dying lamplight. A point, small, bright, metallic. The point of a pin. And the pendulum swung.
Give me your hand 1 minute, and I trace the nerve up the arm I speak about, so I show you much better what I mean. He lurched forward, not because he was told to, not out of fear or compliance, or the helpless cooperation of a broken man. He lurched forward deliberately, with the precise, calculated clumsiness of someone who has been performing collapse all night and knows exactly how it looks. He stretched his arm across the table, clumsy, boneless, the arm of a man who has lost the last of himself to the whiskey. Hensig took the fingers, turned the palm upward, and the touch of those long white fingers, that cold, specific, inhuman touch, did the final thing. The thing that all the whiskey and all the fear and all the long hours of building had been working toward. It moved through him like a current finding its ground, and every nerve in his body went to its utmost limit simultaneously, and then silence. The fear stopped. Not gradually, not in stages, it simply ceased, the way a sound ceases when the source is removed. And what replaced it was something he had no name for, a white, absolute clarity, cold and total, and utterly without tremor. The emotion of fear was gone. In its place, himself, all of himself, compressed and focused and raised by the long repression to a power he had never accessed before. He was sober, completely, finally, irreversibly sober. Not the sobriety of a man who hasn't drunk, but the sobriety of a man who has passed through everything alcohol can do and come out the other side into something beyond it. The white light the whiskey had been promising all evening was here now, filling his mind with a clarity so complete it was almost painful. He knew what to do. He didn't know how he knew. He left that question alone. Hensig's other hand held the pencil. It was moving along the inside of his wrist, slowly, tracing the nerve toward the elbow, pushing the sleeve back with a scholar's careful attention. The touch of it was the touch of something that had never been warm. On the pin embedded in the far end of that pencil, invisible and patient, the germs waited,
cultivated to a virulence beyond medicine, beyond treatment, beyond anything except the quiet, inevitable process of a body being unmade from the inside. The pencil would turn. It would turn in the next few seconds, when Hensig's concentration narrowed to its finest point, when the hold of his intelligence was focused on the single precise act of pressing a pin against a vein. At that moment, that 5-second window at the absolute peak of his attention, he would be open, focused entirely forward, blind to everything else. 5 seconds, no more. Williams lay still and felt the white light in his mind and waited for the pencil to turn.
He raised his eyes. For the first time all night, all the weeks, all the months, all the way back to the cell and the bars and the first moment those blue eyes had found him and decided something, he looked directly into Hensig's face and held it. Didn't flinch, didn't look away, let the room dissolve around them until there was nothing left but that white face in a blaze of its own cold light. And what had been flowing across that table for hours, the venom, the hatred, the patient and remorseless intention, he caught it, all of it, held it for one instant in the white clarity of his recovered mind, and sent it back, with everything behind it. Hensig felt it. Something moved across his face, a flicker, brief and involuntary, the expression of a man who has been absolutely certain of something and has just for the first time been given reason to doubt. A wavering, small, real. Then the large man in the corner woke noisily, lurching upright, and the waiter moved to help him toward the door, and the distraction was everything Hensig needed. His fingers moved. The pencil turned in his grip, slowly, precisely, the pinpoint descending toward the palm lying open in his hand. Williams felt it, the faintest imaginable pressure against his skin. He did not tremble. "When that pin scratches me," he said, and his voice came out firm, clear, entirely sober, the voice of a man who has come back from very far away, "it means death." Hensig could not fully conceal his surprise, but he held. He still believed. He wanted to savor this, had waited too long, planned too carefully to rush the ending. "You tried to get me convicted," he said quietly, his fingers still moving, the pencil descending toward the palm lying open in his hand. The point touched skin. "But the alcohol will counteract it!" Williams burst out laughing, loud, sudden, startling, a laugh that cracked the silence of the room like a stone through glass and threw Hensig's concentration into pieces. The doctor's face came up in pure amazement. That was the moment. The hand that had lain open and helpless and apparently surrendered in his grip turned, fast, with the speed and force that had been gathering all night behind the performance of collapse, and the positions reversed in a single instant. Williams had the wrist, pencil and all, in a grip that had nothing drunken or helpless about it. His other hand swung. The blow landed full in Hensig's face, a smashing, unambiguous, completely deliberate strike that shattered his glasses and drove him back against the wall with a howl that was the first uncontrolled sound the man had made in all the months Williams had known him. Tables went, chairs went, a brief, violent scramble of blows in the wreckage of the corner table, and then an arm from behind, reaching past him. A pistol, held steady, directed at Hensig's bleeding face with the calm authority of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment. Williams turned. The large man from the corner, the one who had snored all evening, apparently insensible, apparently useless, standing now with the easy competence of someone who had never been asleep at all. Dowling's partner, a headquarters detective. Williams stepped back. The room tilted. His legs, which had held him through everything, through the fear and the whiskey and the white clarity and the blow, informed him now, without negotiation, that they were done. His head swum. The white light was fading. The alcohol, held at bay for hours by the extremity of the moment, was returning to collect what it was owed. He was very unsteady on his feet, but he was standing.
"I've been watching your game all evening," the detective said, his voice carrying the easy calm of a man who has never been in any danger at all. The handcuffs went over Hensig's wrists without resistance. "We've been on your trail for weeks. I could have taken you when you left the Brooklyn church a few hours ago, but I wanted to see what you were up to. You're wanted in Berlin for 1 or 2 little dirty tricks. Come along now." Hensig said nothing for a moment. He wiped his bleeding face with the corner of his sleeve, methodical, unhurried, as though the blood were a minor inconvenience rather than the evidence of his first and only defeat. Then he looked up. "You will get nothing," he said quietly. "See, I have scratched myself." The detective didn't understand. He moved on, indifferent. But Williams understood. He looked where the eyes had directed him, at Hensig's own wrist, where a small scratch showed, slightly bleeding. In the struggle, in the scramble of overturned furniture and wild blows and reversed positions, the pin had found a destination, just not the one intended. Williams had time to understand this fully, to feel the complete and extraordinary weight of what it meant, and then the wave came. Everything the night had cost him arrived simultaneously, without mercy, collecting its debt at all once. The fear, the hours, the whiskey, the white clarity, and the blow, and the performance, and the waiting, it all released at the same moment, and the alcohol that had been held at bay by extremity came back with the force of everything that had been deferred. The floor came up to meet him. He went down in a heap and knew nothing more. The illness that followed was nerves. That was all. He was back at his desk in a week or two, and the city received him the way it always received people, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, already in the throes of the next horror. He made inquiries about Hensig's arrest. It had barely been noticed. A small item, if that. No interesting feature, no angle. New York had moved on before the ink was dry. Dowling found him eventually, with the rueful expression of a man who has been cheated out of something he deserved. "No luck, Mr. English," he shook his head. "No luck at all. It would have been a mighty good story, but it never got into the papers." He paused, aggrieved. "That damned German, Schmidt, alias Brunner, alias Hensig, died in the prison hospital before we could even get him remanded for further inquiries." Williams went very still. What did he die of? They're calling it black typhus, terribly swift, dead in 4 days. The doctor said he'd never seen such a case. A silence settled between them. Brief, complete. "I'm glad he's out of the way," Williams said. Dowling sighed with the philosophical resignation of a man who has learned to find injustice everywhere. "Well, yes," he allowed, "but it was a Jim Dandy of a story, and he might have waited just a little bit longer, just long enough so I got something out of it for myself." Williams said nothing. He thought about a scratch on a wrist, about a pin, about germs cultivated past the reach of any medicine in the world, introduced in a moment of contact so brief it might not even be felt. He thought about a man who had spent months hunting him with the patience of something that had never been entirely human, and who had died in 4 days of the thing he had been carrying in his own pocket. He thought about the particular, absolute justice of it. Then he went back to his desk and wrote his story. Not the Hensig story, which no one wanted, but the next one, whatever it was, the city already providing the next horror with its customary efficiency. And he did not think about it again, or told himself he didn't.
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.